Good morning and welcome to the 21st running of Ukraine's quest for mature nation statehood roundtable series devoted to assessing the human resources of the Ukrainian armed forces. My name is Walter Jurkiw. Over the last 3 months, I've had the privilege of being the event's program coordinator. Today, I will have the distinct honor to be its host moderator. As tradition now has shaped it, I will, before turning to the opening remarks session, the word of welcome by our distinguished Ukrainian envoy to the United States, touch very shortly on two matters. We have come to call them the why and the how of the gathering, or quite simply, the context of our discussion and the rules of our discussion. Okay, very quickly on to the why, especially done for those who may be joining us for the first time. Exactly 20 years ago, the year 2000, the core sponsoring organization of today's event, called them the American Friends of Ukraine, witnessed a crucial and double-barreled geopolitical paradigm shift. For one, Ukraine, while recovering from its Soviet past, signaled both through its executive branch and its legislature its intent to head west, or more precisely, to ultimately become a paid-up member of the Euro-Atlantic community with ever stronger bilateral ties to the United States and similarly to its northern Canadian neighbor, Canada, as well as eventual membership in the EU and NATO as the final outcome. Equally critical to the equation, the policymakers and shapers in the United States, in bipartisan fashion, responded to the initiative in a very positive way, quickly embracing the notion of a burgeoning strategic partnership between the two nations. Delighted by the development, these self-same American Friends of Ukraine decided to put together a forum to study the phenomenon more closely. They aptly called it Ukraine's Quest for Mature Nation Statehood, a roundtable. The gathering proved to be one for the ages, a coming together of a veritable who's who of the Washington and Kiev foreign policy establishments, featuring Big Brzezinski, Paul Wolfowitz, Mitch McConnell, the Ukrainian foreign minister at the time, Boris Tarashuk, as keynotes, with the iconic Democratic Representative Sandy Levin opening and the equally iconic GOP Representative Ben Gilman closing. 2 days of intense discussion established that the perceived paradigm shift was desired by all parties involved. Armed with that success, the organizers decided to repeat the event annually and use the gatherings to monitor the progress of Ukraine's Western vector efforts, to explore what standards had to be met and what paths had to be chosen in order to achieve the desired Euro-Atlantic end result. Counting the first, the initial 12 forums, 2000 to 2011, were run as trilogies. The first three examined the specific changes in Ukrainian foreign policy that might result, actually would have to, from the embrace of a Western vector. The second three looked at the internal changes that pre-force had to occur. Movement towards an ever more developed, mature market economy, ever more stable democratic polity, and an ever more stable yet tolerant national identity. The third set explored ways for Ukraine to effectively expand its links to EU, NATO, and Western-oriented regional structures like Visegrad Group, the Weimar Republic, and GUAM. The fourth trilogy looked for ways to strengthen Ukraine's bilateral ties to leading countries in the Euro-Atlantic community. The issues touched upon in the named forums were essentially always overarching in nature, above the fray of the ever boisterous, nay fractious, and constantly situational political scene in Ukraine. Starting in 2011, the described forum process hit a serious hiccup. At some point, the very raison d'etre of the Quest Roundtable series seemed threatened. As the Yanukovych presidency regime began to reveal its darker side in both foreign policy and domestic policy, the situational increasingly impinged on the overarching. In fact, the overarching, Ukraine's chosen path west, no longer seemed so overarching. Fear grew that the path west was not irrevocable or a done deal. That is, in fact, that opposite tendencies were appearing. During that period, the Quest Roundtable series, rather than surrendering to the named fear, took a different tack. For 3 years, it turned out to be a natural trilogy. the organizers took to measuring how badly or quickly the regression into the dark, read Soviet-style past, was occurring. They began running what amounted to an annual report card based on 6 criteria, measuring levels of democracy, economic well-being, general security, energy security, social cohesion, and national identity. 2014, with its Euromaidan revolution and the ouster of the Yanukovych regime, clearly realigned Ukraine's stars to face west again, and this time more decisively. Just note the name. At the same time, the Kremlin decided to punish Ukraine for its choice by annexing Crimea and creating a previously undetectable frozen conflict zone in Donbas. Recognizing that the war, as a nasty external factor in Ukraine's political life, could still do damage to Ukraine's dream of a Euro-Atlantic life, the Quest Roundtable organizers decided to split the difference. 2 sets of gatherings were initiated. The report card forum format would remain and be used in June of every year to measure any harm that the war and its side effects might have been doing to the Ukrainian state. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian Quest Roundtable series, still based in October, would go back to exploring the overarching issues. In other words, looking for ways to effectuate the long-desired move to the Euro-Atlantic future. Returning to the old trilogy framework, 2016 and 18 concentrated on the issue of creating conditions for abiding social cohesion, how Ukraine might better overcome issues of religious, ethnic, and class/gender differences. Starting in 2018 and ending with this conference, the series organizers have tasked themselves with measuring Ukraine's capacity to adopt a Western way to defend itself, Ukraine's ability to embrace the methods of a historically successful NATO alliance and its attitudes towards professionalism, clear strategic vision, and interoperability with allies. In 2018, we explored the efficacy of Ukraine's military-industrial complex. Last year, we took a look at Ukraine's national security priorities, stress on doctrinal matters. This year, focus will center on examining the state of readiness of the general personnel in Ukraine's land, sea, and air defense forces, as well as the capabilities of the senior officers of the said forces. I will just add, incidentally for myself, that to do so, we have assembled a set of speakers that is as iconic as those in the very first event of the series, as you will very shortly see. Now, very quickly to the how. Rules of the game. Keynotes get 20 to 22 minutes. Panelists get 18 to 20 minutes. Lead discussants get 8 to 10 minutes. Moderators get 6 to 8. And the right, the first comment, first question. All questions by participants are entered into the chat rooms. Moderators will read a set and ask relevant speakers to respond. If there's time for a second round, okay, but time is always a factor. The system has 2 channels, one in English and one in Ukrainian. The use of translation mechanism will be especially important in 2 cases. Wonderful, finished. Now on to the very pleasant task of introducing our Ukrainian envoy to the United States and asking him formally, as always, to open our proceedings. I will ask Ambassador Herbst and National Security and Defense Council Secretary Danilov to stand by and be ready for the session that follows. Okay, to my very good friend, Ambassador Yurkiw, who now serves as the ambassador of Ukraine to the United States. Immediately prior to his posting, Ambassador Yurkiw served as permanent representative of Ukraine to the United Nations during a particularly important and perilous time for Ukraine, 2015 to 2019. Earlier, he was the ambassador of Ukraine to Russia. He held the post from 2010 until he was recalled for consultations in March of 14, immediately after the illegal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. Ambassador Yurkiw is one of the true veterans of Ukrainian diplomacy, having started a career in foreign service in 1981. Sir, The webinar floor is all yours, as always. Sir?
Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I would like, first of all, to thank Dr. Walter Zaritsky and the Center for U.S.-Ukraine Relations for your continued support of Ukraine and for organizing this important event today. For over 6 years now, Ukraine has been defending its sovereignty and territorial integrity against Russia's ongoing military aggression. The armed forces of Ukraine, the men and women in uniform, the soldiers who are now in the trenches on the front line, the volunteers who support them, as well as the doctors who save our wounded warriors, are the true heroes fighting today, as we speak, for the freedom of Ukraine and Europe. With all the challenges that Ukraine is facing, they are defending our land from the gravest one, which threatens the country's very existence. Today, our armed forces are in a much different shape compared to what they were in 2014, at the beginning of Russian aggression. Nowadays, our military is one of the strongest in Europe. In 2014, that was not the case. After the years of Yanukovych regime, when the Ukrainian military was run by defense minister who was a Russian citizen and who systematically tried to weaken it, selling everything that could be sold and dismantling everything that could be dismantled, the combat-ready forces were minimal. In fact, even from the beginning of Ukraine's independence, Ukrainian army has been decreasing in size and in power. In 1994, Ukraine gave up the world's third largest nuclear arsenal in exchange for security assurances under the Budapest Memorandum, subsequently cynically violated by Russia, one of the signatories that purported to assume Ukraine's security. Disarmament included not just nuclear missiles, but also military aviation, as well as some conventional means of warfare, from mines to manpads. For years, Ukraine's economic conditions did not allow for sufficient resources to modernize and develop the military. In fact, it was never a top priority, as we were certainly not thinking of attacking anyone and could not even imagine that we would be under attack by one of our neighbors, a guarantor of our security. We could not fathom that one of permanent members of the UN Security Council would flout the most fundamental norms of international law, the UN Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, and would, for the first time since World War II, seek to redraw Europe's borders by force. But this is exactly what happened, and Russia's war against Ukraine has already surpassed World War II in duration. Since 2014, defending our land and rebuilding our military has become an existential priority. All the state resources have been channeled to that end, and hundreds of thousands of people volunteered to help, from giving their time, money, and property to enlisting for active duty, taking up arms, and going to the front line to fight. Over 14,000 people have been killed, over 27,000 wounded. The war changed the understanding of reality, which is that we need to build a strong military and that we need to be a part of the system of collective defense. During the Revolution of Dignity, Ukrainians have once and for all proven their choice to be an integral part of the Western family of democracy and a nation that is a full-fledged member and an integral part of transatlantic institutions. These are the values Ukrainians are fighting for in the battlefields of Donbas, defending not just their land, but the entire European flank of Europe and NATO from Russian aggression. Ukraine joined the North Atlantic Cooperation Council in 1991 and the Partnership for Peace program in 1994. And in 1997, Ukraine and NATO signed a charter on a distinctive partnership. Ukraine is the only country that is not a member of the alliance, which has taken part in all NATO-led operations and missions, including Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan, where Ukrainian soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder with American soldiers. Through implementing annual national programs, Ukraine is consistently moving forward with reforms that bring our country closer to membership in the alliance, in line with the decisions of the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest. Membership in NATO, as well as in the EU, is a strategic goal of Ukraine, which is envisaged in the Ukrainian constitution. Together with the alliance, we're implementing comprehensive reforms in the security and defense sector, which is vital for Ukraine's democratic development and for strengthening its ability to defend itself, and joining efforts aimed at capability development and capacity building in Ukraine. Over the course of the past years, the status conditions of Ukrainian armed forces have changed almost beyond recognition. One of the small examples is the growing number of uniformed women in the Ukrainian armed forces, with the possibility to hold the so-called combat positions. On June 12, 2020, Ukraine became one of 6 countries known as Enhanced Opportunity Partners under the Partnership Interoperability Initiative that make particularly significant contributions to NATO operations and other alliance objectives, and received enhanced opportunities for dialogue and cooperation with the allies. We greatly value the support of the international community in our reforms of security and defense sector, which will contribute to the joint Euro-Atlantic security and help Ukraine to become a full-fledged member of European and transatlantic community. In this regard, I would like to underline the importance and value of the support of the United States of America, the biggest and the closest Ukrainian ally, and a true friend and a strategic partner. The United States provides Ukraine with political and technical assistance through various bilateral programs. Over the past several years, we received counter-battery radars, night vision devices, thermal imagers, secure digital radios, medical kits, vehicles, as well as lethal weapons, including the Javelin anti-tank missiles, which are a real game changer on the ground. Last October, the first 2 Island-class patrol boats arrived to Odessa, and several more are getting ready to be transferred in the nearest time frame. In fact, last week I had the opportunity to inspect them in person in Baltimore. We are not only receiving the US assistance, we are also buying US defense equipment. Last December, we made a deal to procure Javelin and anti-tank missiles, the first such deal between Ukraine and the US under the Foreign Military Sales Program. We hope that more high-tech equipment will be purchased in the US soon. Furthermore, the United States has approved the transfer and sale of up to 16 Mark VI patrol boats, which will considerably boost our naval capabilities. The US has been providing significant assistance with training our armed forces, raising their capabilities, and improving their interoperability with NATO allies. In turn, our military are sharing their first-hand knowledge of combat with Russia and countering Russian hybrid warfare. Through cooperation with our partners and through the efforts of the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people, our military is getting much stronger. It is holding the line and defending our land. In closing, I would like to thank once again the organizers of this timely and important event, and I very much look forward to our further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for your words. And you've really always, I must admit, always set the context for our discussions. That's why we always welcome you as the first word. Now, I'd like to, with that, I'd like to be able to very quickly now move to our roundtable highlight focus session. The theme of the first session, of the first focus session, will be the general state of preparedness of the Ukrainian armed forces. And it would be from the government of Ukraine's point of view. The chair will be Ambassador John Herbst, who at this moment is the director of the Euro-Asian Center at the Atlantic Council of the United States, a very old friend, and perhaps, and I'm going to say it, one of the finest ambassadors that Ukraine has had from the United States. He has been a friend for a very long time. He will run the session, and the featured speaker will be the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Mr. Alexei Danilov. I hand it over to you and your very capable hands, Ambassador Herbst, as always. Please, sir.
Hey, Walter, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. My job today is to speak briefly about the readiness of Ukraine's armed forces, and then to introduce our honored speaker, the National Security and Defense Council head, Alexei Danilov. There's a problem, though. I'm not a military professional. I was a diplomat. You have real military experts today and tomorrow on the panels. So I will take a slightly different tack and focus briefly on Ukraine's overall security. And in fact, Ambassador Yelchenko foreshadows some of the things I'd like to say. I remember well the dark days of April 2014. After seizing Crimea, Russian forces started their hybrid war, their hybrid operation in Luhansk and Donetsk. And after taking those two cities, Russian-led forces began moving west to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Of course, in May of 2014, you had a signal political event in Ukraine, the election of a new president, Petro Poroshenko, and shortly after taking office, he began a counteroffensive. And amazingly, he would have taken back, Ukrainian forces would have taken back all of Donbas in the spring and summer of 2014 if Russian regular troops had not entered into Ukraine and defeated the Ukrainian counteroffensive at Ilovaisk in early September. I visited Ukraine for the first time after 8 long years, after having been ambassador in Kyiv, in June of 2014. And I had a lot of very good meetings. And what I heard from Ukrainian interlocutors in late June of 2014 was the following: that when the Kremlin operations began, first Crimea and then Donbas, and Ukraine began to look at its resources to withstand Kremlin aggression, they found out of the hundreds of thousands of security personnel in the military, in the border guards, in the Ministry of Interior, in the secret police and the SBU, there were approximately 5,000 who were trained, equipped, and verifiably loyal. And of course, with such a small number, defeating a major power is not simple, not easy. But again, Ukrainian society, Ukrainian political leadership, starting with Poroshenko, began the arduous task of creating reliable, trained, and equipped armed forces. And I remember being told that by the summer, there were 30 to 40,000 such people, fighting forces. And again, with that, Ukraine took back most of Donbas and would have taken back all of it if the Red Army had not intervened. As Ambassador Yelchenko said, we've come a long way since then. Of course, there were some hard moments on this long path. Moscow began a second offensive in Donbas in late December, early January 2014, 2015. And that too was led by Russian forces, by especially Russian special forces. And the Kremlin seized more Ukrainian territory, but Ukrainian fought back and was able to hold the line. And that led to the second ceasefire, the one that was signed in February of 2015. And that ceasefire, of course, has been violated every single day since it was established. And in fact, Moscow made some serious gains in Ukraine's southeast after the ceasefire was signed in the following 72 hours. But since then, despite the everyday shelling, Ukraine has essentially held the line. Put another way, Ukraine has fought the most powerful military force in Europe to a stalemate within the constraints of Moscow's operation. And those constraints relate to a variety of factors. First, of course, the Russian people don't want their soldiers fighting Ukraine. So Putin has to hide his war. That's not the only reason why Putin hides his war. The second reason, of course, is US and European EU sanctions. He denies, of course, that this is a Russian war on Ukraine. He says it's a Ukrainian civil war, which is nonsense. But he does that, again, to hide the war from his people and to, so far, to enhance his failed effort to persuade the West to ease sanctions. And a third point, of course, is in Ukraine's successful standing off the Kremlin are the Western supplies, especially the American military supplies that Ambassador Yelchenko already described. But it's important to recognize that the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian society are the principal authors of Ukraine's success thus far in withstanding further Kremlin aggression. I remember seeing that ingenuity up front because I'm in Ukraine. Until COVID, I was in Ukraine 8 or 9 times a year. And I remember seeing what Ukraine was doing, developing its own drones. At that point, the West and other countries were unwilling to sell Ukraine the drones that it needed. And Ukraine was using its own manpower, its own ingenuity to create effective drones. Ukraine was conducting very, very effective electronic warfare along the front. The next challenge that Moscow threw down to Ukraine began in the spring of 2018, when they decided to harass in a major way Ukrainian shipping or all shipping into and out of Ukraine's seaports in the Sea of Azov. But here too, Ukraine has managed. While those efforts by the Kremlin led to a dropping of 30–40% of shipping for Ukraine in the Sea of Azov, Ukraine was able to send many of its products from Donbas by railroad and car to get it out to world markets. And then, of course, Ukraine, with American support, began to work on an asymmetric threat to Kremlin military superiority in the Sea of Azov. The U.S. helped build radar on the coast of Ukrainian coast of Azov, and we began to supply ships. And I hope we're in the process of providing anti-ship missiles to be the equivalent at sea of what we've done with javelins on land. Bottom line, Ukraine, this is against every smart analyst in the world, has managed to make the war in Donbas as big a liability, if not bigger a liability for Putin than it is for the political leadership in Ukraine. And that is a major achievement. And that's why I think Ukraine will win. Okay, that was the first part of my task. The second part of my task is the main one, which has introduced our featured speaker. I had the opportunity and the honor to meet Alexei Danilov in his office back in February, before COVID really hit. And he's had an extraordinary career. He was one of the youngest mayors in Ukrainian history. He was a mayor of Luhansk at the age of 31 in the early 90s. President Yushchenko made him governor of Luhansk, the oblast, in 2005. And he's demonstrated his ability to work across the political spectrum in Ukraine. He worked with Yulia Tymoshenko, and of course, he's now working with President Zelensky as the head of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. And so, Mr. Secretary, over to you. Walter, thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Дякую, пане посол. Вітаю всіх учасників. Перш за все, щиро дякую, що запросили поспілкуватися з приводу тих подій, які сьогодні відбуваються в світі і в Україні. Хотів би зауважити, пане посол Херц, що губернаторів в Україні немає. Губернатори є тільки в Росії. У нас голови обласних державних адміністрацій. І коли російський наратив нам постійно закидають, це один із елементів такої гібридної війни, які вони постійно нам щось таке пропонують. Хотів би сказати, що сама Російська Федерація є штучним утворенням. Всі пам'ятають, коли вони на початку минулого сторіччя під дулами автоматів збирали населення під свою парасольку. І хто не був згодних, то просто розстрілювали. Дуже багато людей туди поїхало на Захід. Дуже багато емігрувало в Канаду, Сполучені Штати в той час. І рано чи пізно це штучне утворення, воно розвалиться, і це буде за наших часів, ми з вами це будемо бачити. Бо те, що вони сьогодні роблять, вони сьогодні тримаються тільки на зовнішніх ворогах. У них спочатку вороги було Сполучені Штати, потім НАТО, потім Грузія, потім Україна. І якщо не буде зовнішніх ворогів, то ця федерація дуже-дуже швидко розвалиться. На превеликий жаль, були часи, коли прийшов Путін до влади, в Росію шаленим потоком потекли нафтодолари. Газові долари, нафтодолари – це були те підґрунтя, на базі чого формувалося повне переозброєння російської армії. І ви знаєте, що починаючи з 91-го року, Російська Федерація вважає, що Україна є щось для них неприродним суб'єктом, і вони постійно на цьому наголошували. Було приклад, коли Путін у 2008 році, перебуваючи в Сполучених Штатах, спілкуючися з президентом Сполучених Штатів, робив висловлення, що Україна штучне утворення, і що вона не має розвитку, і якщо ми підемо до НАТО, то ми розвалимося. Як показують історичні події, які далі почали відбуватися, це якраз навпаки. Я впевнений, що Україна здобуде перемогу в цій війні, яку розв'язала Російська Федерація, і наша незалежність буде підтверджена. Чому? Тому що український народ – це є народ, який ніколи не здавався. Народ, який обов'язково все своє поверне собі. І Крим, і Донецька, Луганська частина області, які сьогодні є окуповані саме Російська Федерація, будуть знаходитися під українським прапором. Росія сьогодні дуже багато робить для того, щоб це не сталося. Вони сьогодні продовжують всі види втручання в наш процес нашого життя. Починається від того, що вони втручаються через кібер, втручаються через багато інших речей. І я можу сказати, що наші хлопці і дівчата, які сьогодні на фронті боронять нашу незалежність, їм треба віддати велику шану, і ми всіх їх шануємо. І ви знаєте, що Володимир Зеленський з великою повагою відноситься до всіх цих людей, і стільки разів, скільки президент Зеленський був на лінії зіткнення, це каже про те, що у нас є дуже велике бажання, щоб війна закінчилась, але тільки на умовах України. На інших умовах ми цю війну закінчити не можемо, тому що українське суспільство нам це не дозволить. Я хочу сказати, що 14 вересня в Україні указом президента була затверджена стратегія національної безпеки України, де визначено чіткий наш шлях до НАТО і до Євросоюзу. Ми сьогодні дійсно, як сказав наш посол в Сполучених Штатах, ми сьогодні боронимо Європу від російської навали. Ми є сьогодні на цьому рубежі. І я хотів би подякувати перш за все і Сполученим Штатам, і всім нашим партнерам, які є в Європі, за ту підтримку, яку ви нам надаєте. Але хотів звернути увагу, повертаючись до подій 94-го року, коли, на превеликий жаль, ми підписали Будапештський меморандум, який, як виявляється, на превеликий жаль, не працює. Хочу звернути увагу на події 2008 року, коли саме Німеччина були проти того, щоб Україні надали ПДЧ для того, щоб ми швидше рухались в НАТО. Але життя триває, ми рухаємося, ми зупинятися не збираємося. І я дуже вдячний нашим партнерам з НАТО, що в цьому році ми отримали програму розширеного співробітництва, програму розширених можливостей. Це каже про те, що ми не є поодинокі в цій боротьбі. І ми обов'язково будемо рухатися в цьому плані для того, щоб достигати стандартів НАТО, для того, щоб ми могли відстоювати свою незалежність. Декілька слів по події, які сьогодні розгортаються. Ви бачите, що відбувається сьогодні в Білорусі. Ви бачите, що може відбуватися найближчим часом в Молдові. Там 1 листопада будуть вибори. І втручання Російської Федерації на цих територіях є дійсно шаленим. І це для нас ще один виклик, це для нас ще одна загроза. у нас би не було великого бажання, щоб російський вплив там продовжував домінувати. Тому ми з свого боку будемо робити все можливе від нас для того, щоб, перш за все, демократичні цінності і ті стандарти, які пропонують провідні країни світу, вони були зафіксовані безпосередньо, вже зацементовані в нашій країні, і в країні наших сусідів. Це безпосередньо є наша безпека. Те, що стосується ситуації, пов'язаної з армією, то вже пан посол казав, що, на превеликий жаль, після 2010 року, коли до влади майже прийшла Російська Федерація тут, на чолі з паном Януковичем, не тільки міністр оборони був представником спецслужб Російської Федерації, а також голова Служби безпеки, керівник підприємства «Укроборонпром». І дуже багато тут було хлопців, які були з погонами російських спецслужб. Вони тут були, нібито будували країну. Насправді вони готували все для того, щоб її здавати. Пам'ятаємо Харківські угоди, коли продовжили термін перебування Чорноморського флоту. Але я хочу згадати події. Я саме був у Вільнюсі, коли не був підписаний оцей документ, який там Янукович мав підписати. Я дуже добре пам'ятаю утро наступного дня, коли літак відправлявся на Київ, і в аеропорту зібралися українські політики, і вони були всі засмучені. А я сказав, що ви не смутіться, зараз все тільки починається. Це наш шанс скинути російську навалу, скинути ці кайдани і рухатися до незалежної країни. Я хочу сказати, що за останні 6 років українська армія стала зовсім іншою. Свого часу, за радянських часів, ви знаєте, що всі наші військові формування, вони були на західному кордоні. І ми не очікували, що ті люди, які називають нібито нас братами, що вони будуть так себе поводити. Але сталося те, що сталося. Ви знаєте, ви звернули увагу, що я був мером Луганська, головою Луганської обласної державної адміністрації. Я безпосередньо там народився і вирос. І коли вони кажуть, що то є Росія, я можу сперечатися до почервоніння, що то є не так. То є українська земля, і ми свою землю нікому віддавати не збираємося. Повертаючись до стану Збройних сил, який є сьогодні, я можу впевненості сказати, що той стан, який є, це не стан 2014 року, це зовсім інша армія, вона набагато сильніша, вона набагато вже по-іншому озброєна. Я дякую всім країнам НАТО, які дають нам інструкторів і готують наших хлопців і дівчат саме по стандартам НАТО. Ви знаєте, що у нас працюють полігони, там, де є інструктори, які допомагають нам освоювати всі навики, які сучасні є в сучасному світі. Я хочу сказати, що переозброєння, яке зараз триває в армії, в цьому році ми маємо 6,14% від нашого ВВП на сектор безпеки і оборони. На проєкті бюджету на 2021 рік цифра буде сягати так само не менше 5,93%. Це дуже потужні цифри, такого не було ніколи. Я можу сказати, що за часів минулих фінансування армії не перевищило 1,5, максимум було 1,8% від нашого ВВП, те, що стосується сектора безпеки і оборони. Зараз ситуація змінюється, ми займаємося власними ракетами, ми з нашими партнерами розбудовуємо сучасну, потужну українську армію. Крім того, я хотів звернути, що в лютому місяці президент Зеленський підписав указ, рішення Ради нацбезпеки і оборони про реформування сектору безпеки і оборони. У нас є віце-прем'єр-міністр пан Уруський, який зараз цим питанням потужно починає займатися. Наша позиція доволі проста. Максимальна корпоратизація військово-промислового комплексу, залучення партнерів країн-членів НАТО до спільного виробництва військової техніки, військового обладнання, військових ракет на території України. Таке наше завдання, так ми ставимо перед собою завдання і розуміємо, що рано чи пізно над Кримським півостровом, над окупованою територією Донецької, Луганської області будуть майорити український флаг. Чому я в цьому впевнений? Тому що в Україні воюють не тільки військові, у нас воює вся країна. І наш волонтерський рух, і наші всі хлопці, дівчата, незалежно від віку, вони все це доказали. Україна непереможна країна, особисто таким сусідам в лапках, як Російська Федерація. Дякую за увагу. Якщо до мене є якісь питання, я готовий на них відповісти.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. That was a wonderful description of Ukraine's strategic position. I'd like to ask the first question, and I encourage people who are listening in to list their questions in the Q&A section underneath your screen. You can see it there. Okay, Mr. Danilov, do you think that there is a danger of Russian escalation in its war on Ukraine in the coming months?
Ще раз. З урахуванням того, що відбувається сьогодні в світі, з урахуванням ситуації, пов'язаної з Білорусією, з Молдовою, в Карабахі, ми вважаємо, що така загроза існує, і вона існувала постійно.
Okay, that's a nice, quick answer. How might that threat appear? What might the Russians do?
Ну, по-перше, зараз ви знаєте, що вона пробує політичний вплив. Вона сьогодні вкладає шалені гроші в політичні сили, які розраховані на російський сегмент і саме на російськомовне населення. Ви знаєте, що пан Лавров зробив свого часу заяву, коли він сказав, що вони захищають, мають на всьому світі не росіян, а російськомовних. Тому просування російської мови для них є домінантою не тільки в Україні, а в всьому світі. Вони в це вкладають великі гроші. Те, що стосується безпосередньо військового втручання, я думаю, що якщо Путін на це зважиться, то він буде мати дуже потужну відсіч від українського війська.
Okay. We have a question from Victoria Fallendish. How has COVID-19 affected the Ukrainian military?
Ну, на превеликий жаль, ця пандемія, яка є не тільки в Україні, а в всьому світі, звичайно, вносить свої корективи в наше життя і в життя військових так само. Але на сьогоднішній день, Богу дякувати, великої проблеми, великої пандемії саме серед військових немає. Там приймається максимальна система захисту для того, щоб не було розповсюдження цієї хвороби саме в військах. І ми сьогодні ситуацію тримаємо на контролі. І кожного ранку є доповідь з цього приводу. І те, що стосується захворювання військових, доповідь робиться по окремій, скажімо так, по окремій ситуації. Ситуація складна, але вона є повністю контрольована сьогодні.
Thank you. We have a question from our host, Walter Zaritsky. Could you comment about the fact of Russia introducing nuclear weapons into Crimea?
Я можу сказати, що перш за все, Росія, на наш погляд, до цього максимально готуються. Перш за все, те, що там може вже бути ядерна зброя, таке підтвердження остаточного у нас немає, але розуміння, що це може статися найближчим часом, ми все чітко усвідомлюємо, що так і може бути. Це буде залежати від багатьох чинників, і якщо вони будуть бачити, що вони програють, вони обов'язково будуть цим питанням користуватися. Вони, ви знаєте, у нас в стратегії там розписано, для чого вони захопили Крим. Це вони роблять плацдарм для того, щоб мати вплив саме в цьому повністю регіоні. Там іде повністю зараз переозброєння армії, там сьогодні постійно відбувається навчання. Більш того, за даними нашої розвідки, вони завезли вже туди більше ніж 600 тисяч громадян Російської Федерації, заселили туди на територію Криму за останні 2 роки.
Thank you. Walter, do we have time for any more questions?
One more.
One more.
This has been a very good session,
Okay.
but one more, yes. I think there is one left, and that is dealing with the assistance question. Do you see it, Ambassador? What more would you like to see in assistance from the West
Okay.
/ free world?
Mr. Secretary, one last question then. What would you like to see from how can the United States help Ukraine further strengthen its security? What else should we do?
Ви знаєте, ми зараз аналізуємо ситуацію у всьому світі і можемо сказати, що високоточна зброя – це те, що нам точно потрібно для боротьби з Російською Федерацією. Це дуже важливе для нас сьогодні питання. Саме високоточна зброя.
Dякую.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Secretary Danilo, for a wonderful conversation. And Walter, thank you for this event.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I just wanted to thank both of you. I don't want to use the word laconic, but the fact that you finished on time and the answers were so direct. What you delivered and certainly what the Secretary delivered was just the facts, ma'am, as they say in the United States. So I'm very grateful for that. Again, I know that we will see you again at future events that we hold. Thank you very much again. With that, I'm going to be turning to our Roundtable Plenary Session 1. That is the panel discussion session 1. The theme, 1, if by land, taking measure of Ukraine's ground forces. The moderator will be Ambassador William Courtney. The panelists will be former Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Andriy Zagorodnyuk, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, and lead discussant will be Heritage Foundation's Luke Coffey. Just wanted to simply say on my behalf that Ambassador Courtney has done yeoman's work for us for many, many years. His work at RAND is especially important for us. And I also wanted to mention that General Ben Hodges has been truly a personal friend on this one, because he's helped me garner the forces that we assembled for this event. And for that, I'm truly grateful. So with that, Ambassador Courtney, would you take the first panel? Sir?
Walter, thank you very much. Our speakers on today's panel will discuss Ukrainian ground forces. To help you understand what these forces are up against, let me cite a few findings from a major RAND study on Russian ground forces. Published last year, the RAND analysis found Russia has maintained a massed and area effects threat by retaining a large volume of indirect fire launchers and munitions from the former Soviet Union with some modernization. Russia's rapidly deployable forces, including airborne and GRU Spetsnaz, also build on Soviet-era formations, but they represent new and dramatically reformed forces, such as novel or new sophisticated C4ISR systems, command, control, communications, computer, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Russia's highly advanced air defense systems build on extensive Soviet-era investment in air defenses. Russia's electronic warfare capabilities show how Russia has invested in capabilities that can asymmetrically counter perceived US advantages. Russia will continue to focus on achieving dominance in its near abroad, with an emphasis on readiness and professionalization of a small component of the force. Some expansion and incremental improvements will occur in Russia's long-range strike forces, rapidly deployable forces, C4ISR, and air defense. At the same time, maneuver ground forces and indirect fires are likely to face relative stagnation. Russia's ground capabilities will continue to develop, but they will be constrained by political, demographic, economic, and social factors within Russia, which will likely change slowly over the next 5 to 10 years. US support for partners is likely unable significantly to undermine Russia's regional dominance. But the US military can bolster partner security forces through investment in such areas as units focused on providing security force assistance, information operations, military medical units, and foreign area officers. This study, if you're interested, is on the RAND website. It deals with the future of Russian ground forces. Now let me just introduce a little bit more our three speakers. Andrei Zahorodnyuk is a Ukrainian entrepreneur and political leader. He was Minister of Defense from August 2019 to March 2020. And earlier, he headed the Reform Project Office at the Ministry of Defense. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges III has served as Commanding General, United States Army Europe, in the capacity in which I might say he had a high and very positive profile. He is currently the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington. Luke Coffey is Director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Previously, he was the Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Fellow. Several years earlier, he served at the British Ministry of Defense as a senior special advisor to then Defense Secretary Liam Fox. Let's first turn to Minister Zahorodnyuk. Please begin.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me on this conference. It's a great honor to be here. And I'm really impressed with the speakers Walter have collected for this conference. So it's really impressive, and indeed it's an honor for me to be among them. So I'm sure we'll have a great time during these 2 days. So far, I have heard Mr. Ambassador, and Secretary for Defense Council in NSDC in Ukraine, and they have outlined the general political situation which surrounds Ukraine. Our section is on the ground forces, but let me say that obviously any consideration of any specific force, any estimation of readiness, any estimation of the capability have to be taken into account from a perspective of the general security in the region. We clearly understand that the decisions whether to continue or not to continue the war are not made in Donbas. They're not made by people who call themselves separatists and so on, because they're reporting to Russian army, they're reporting to Russian armed forces, they're reporting to Moscow, they're receiving salaries from there. We know exactly which units they serve before they come to Ukraine. So essentially, these are Russian troops, and the decisions are made in Moscow. So it's a highly political issue, and we clearly see that this is a part of a much bigger picture of Russian attempt to dominate the region. We see situation in Belarus, we see situation in Georgia, we see the situation in the Black Sea, where they use the Crimea as the platform for expansion in the Atlantic and in the Middle East, quite successfully so far. And they're building up navy, they're building up armed forces inside Crimea. There was a discussion about the nuclear weapons, which is still ongoing. And so basically, when we're saying that we are, what is about the strengths and the readiness? I'm getting back to the topic of the conversation, of the original topic of the conversation. What is the readiness and the strengths of the ground, of the land forces and generally Ukrainian armed forces? It's obviously have to be, we can look at that mathematically and compare to the capabilities of Russia. And obviously, they have much more equipment. They have much more power, and their budgets are much higher. But at the same time, we have managed to, from 2014, to stop them and did not let them advance further. We clearly know that Donbas was not, especially that part on Donbas, which was eastern Ukraine, which is occupied, wasn't their final goal. Their final goal is not to let Ukraine to become an independent and successful European democracy. That's what their goal is. And with this goal, they're using all means possible: information warfare, constant cyber attacks, political pressure in Europe, energy systems like Nord Stream 2, and obviously the land forces in Donbas and Navy in the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. So, any consideration of any of these parts should be done in a complex and cannot be done as some kind of a separate story. However, obviously, I have to tell you that everybody mentioned this so far, and I fully agree that the land forces in 2014 and land forces now are completely different armies. I mean, they're not same, they're not similar, because it's a massive upgrade from what I've seen. The first time I was in the summertime 2014 in the ATO, as it was called, in Donbas, and I've seen the state at which the armed forces been at that time, how they were equipped, what was their readiness, what was their general state. And when I had an honor to be a minister for the defense, I visited extensively the troops in Donbas, and I've seen a completely different picture. And obviously, I've spoken to many different analysts and officers and soldiers and sailors and so on. So this information comes from all different places, including from our partners. The situation is that the motivation, first of all, obviously the motivation is much higher than among Russians, because in their case, a lot of them do not understand, rightfully so, what they're doing there. What's the purpose of their existence generally? Why they're there, except for making some money. In our case, people are defending the country, and this you can see that from every time when you travel, starting from 2014 and still now. And motivation is still there, despite this is extremely boring, extremely dull, and very tiresome activity. What happens right now, which is in many cases is a typical trench warfare, and despite that, which psychologically impacts quite a lot. But we see that this is the motivation is present. The troops are well trained. I mean, they're trained. I mean, the training is a constant activity. What they do when they're not in the what is called right now as a GFO, Joint Force Operation, which was called ATO until recently. And they're constantly training. They're constantly preparing. They are much better equipped. We still have challenges. Obviously, the challenges are. I'll get to them later. But generally, the overall capability is obviously much improved. I have to say that when I've been there and I spoke to many officers which are currently there in the GFO and also traveling around Ukraine in their permanent basis, a lot of the first of all, most of the commanders have a very clear, very practical battlefield experience, and this experience is obviously impacting their decisions. They are extremely skilled. They have a very good knowledge of what's actually happening. A lot of the doctrines which they've been changing, they changed based on their practical experience and their practical skills. So from the experience perspective, probably this is one of the best armies in Europe for sure. From that perspective, because most of the people who run the forces right now, they've been there. And there is a very specific policy of their commanders is to appoint people who has battlefield experience to the management positions. Ground forces right now is about about a half of total number, and the total number is 250,000, out of which is civilians are 46,000. So we're talking about service people about 204,000 roughly, and land forces are half of that. They are. I'm not going to take your time on describing what kind of types of the brigades there and type of the military are there, because there's all different kinds. There's a mechanical brigades and mechanical infantry brigades. There are tank brigades. There are artillery. There are missiles. There are obviously all kinds of support services and so on. Majority of them have been through the battles. All brigades has a substantial level of experience. Some of them are more ready. Some of them are better equipped. Some of them less equipped. And generally speaking, indeed, Ukraine been increasing the budgets pretty much every year. This year, we have managed the budget for armed forces of 2.7 of GDP, which is 117 billion hryvnias. Altogether for the army, for the Ministry of Defense, it was 136 billion, which is largest budget ever. However, even that budget is not enough, because indeed the replacement of the equipment takes time, and it's even not close to what we would like to see. So, despite of constant arrival of the new equipment to the forces, we still need way more. And that's where the development of the industry is critical, development of the partnerships is critical, development of new technologies is critical, and so on. We have some interesting developments from this. We have some quite good innovations, for example, on the missile side. Neptune and the Vilha, all these types of missiles, they're coming and new, and they're obviously increasing. But we still have a long way to go, despite of the progress. So on the training, as I said, there is a constant training program which runs pretty robust. There is a massive training field in Cherokee Land where pretty much all brigades going through of the land forces. And obviously, as we all know, in Starich, in Lviv region, there is an international center through which constantly the brigades passing. And with the help of our partners, and these are missions called Orbital, Unify, and GMTGU, US, Canada, and the UK, and with the support of Polish and some other countries, and Lithuania, Estonia, etc., on a smaller scale, but nevertheless very important. So I would like to thank all of them for huge support and training. I've met many officers which have passed through the training, still serving, and still applying that knowledge. On a challenges side, we can clearly see that the doctrine needs update, because there's still been some doctrines are outdated. Some of them updated, but that whole movement has to speed up, especially when we're talking about transferring to the NATO standards. We had a major breakthrough with political side. This is EOP. EOP came early actually than we expected. We expected to be around this time of the year, but it actually came in the summertime. It gives massive opportunities to Ukraine and to NATO. And by the way, pretty much every Western officer who I spoke to for all these years, he or she confirmed that our partners are learning from Ukrainians same way as Ukrainians learn from our partners. So it's an exchange of experience, and it's extremely important from everybody who I've heard. It's extremely important for our partners as well. The turnover of in the land forces is higher than in the other ones. We have about 10%, so people leaving every year. We consider this obviously high, and especially if we're talking about that sometimes the very skilled and well prepared officers or soldiers leave, that can be addressed through increasing of the social support. We have a very serious challenge this year, which is part of, by the way, even American conditionalities for the assistance, is the development of the system of military career. It has started development, but it's still in a sort of early stage. When we have an effective system, we believe that should impact morale. Also, the things like providing more IT systems and digitizing bureaucracy, what they call, should impact, because bureaucracy is one of the most demotivating factors so far. Obviously, provision of the building houses, building the infrastructure, and so on. So these things, when they improve, they raise morale tremendously. And I've seen this. There are better equipped brigades and there are worse equipped brigades, and morale quite depends on the conditions in which they serve. Physical conditions in GFO zone is. I've actually spent some time there in the trenches. It's usually when people send pictures and they look quite rough and quite abrupt, but in reality they keep quite acceptable conditions for many of them. They have good support, they have medical support, the food, and so on. So from that perspective, it's something which Ukraine over these years achieved something for sure. However, we clearly see that generally the motivation is very impacted by a number of things, and one of them is information warfare, which effects of which we see pretty much on a daily basis. Russia is actively broadcasting their TV in the region. They're broadcasting radio. They're broadcasting all these kinds of through the various media. And people in the region, they watch sometimes Russian TV, and that impacts general understanding of what's happening. So addressing this issue, I know it's in a high priority of the government. They opened a new TV channel for these regions in the Russian language. But generally speaking, the information support for all the people in the eastern Ukraine, including armed forces, which is there, has to be improved. We have seen on a positive side, there is definitely should be mentioned that NCO Corps has been going through a major reform. We have seen the effects of this reform because the Soviet approach to the NCOs and the NATO standards approach are different. And we're switching gradually to the NATO standards, and there are new schools for the NCOs, for surgeons, as well as new schools for some specialized operations like sniper, for example, schools, or some IT schools and so on. But the NCO school is considered one of the best. It has extremely good reviews, and we're really proud of the movement which is happening there. So I think the prospects are really positive. So generally, the professionalization of people, of the service people, of soldiers, sailors who are serving there, it's going up. At the same time, we still have conscription. So conscription is roughly about 10% of overall amount of service people, and in some cases it's higher. It's about 13%. So we regularly conscribe in each year about 27,000 soldiers, and many of them go to the land forces, mechanical infantry brigades, and other ones. And I have to say that in land forces, the loyalty, so the ones who after conscription sign the contract, it's actually quite low. So, for example, in Marines, in special operations, in airborne, it's much higher. In many brigades, there's like 10%, 20% resigning. In land, it's lower. And that shows that generally the conscription model, which currently exists, which didn't much change for the years, it's outdated. And there is a quite substantial plan to change it. because they don't go to GFO, they don't serve in the battlefield. They conscribed guys. So they're mainly doing supportive functions, but the key reason for this conscription is to build up reserve. We believe there are much better ways to build up reserve than that. So that generally has to be mentioned. The education on and the connection to the conscription is the territorial defense. So territorial defense is still with the land forces. Territorial defense needs a major reform. There is a new law which has been just given to the parliament on the territorial defense. Basically, the idea of it is to prepare really capable, really high readiness reserve of active and motivated individuals. Some of them veterans, some of them new. So, if all these plans are implemented, we'll have a massive growth of generally the country's resilience, and we'll look at that as one of the key priorities for the future. And it's in the hands of land forces, so that's why I'm kind of mentioning it right now. So generally, as you know, there's been a division between the forces generation and forces employment. It provided a quite good effect already, I think, because the people who are planning the operations, they're working in JFO command, and then generally the land force command, they are preparing the army, they're equipping it, and looking at all the kind of generation sort of functions. And from everybody who I asked, everybody's supporting this quite strongly. What have happened? I mean, so they understand that NATO standards is our future. There is a huge expectation that we will be getting more interoperable. They have a huge motivation growth when they return from the exercises together with our partners from Yavoriv and other places. So generally, this whole movement to NATO is not only to strengthen Ukraine from a collective defense perspective and strengthen NATO from a participation of Ukraine, but it's also a massive motivation factor for the service people, which you can see. Basically, I think my time is up, so I would like any comments or questions, because obviously there's much more to tell.
Mr. Minister, thank you very much. We'll ask all of our remaining speakers, so the other two, to make their comments, and then we'll go to general Q&A. Thank you. Those are terrific remarks. It was a great tour de horizon. General Hodges.
Ambassador Courtney, Bill, thank you very much. And I have to say how exciting it is to hear the former Minister of Defense talking about the importance of the Corps of non-commissioned officers, the sergeants, that for any professional army, the sergeants are the backbone. And that's also what connects an army to the population, because every family knows a sergeant. And so I think the focus that is being placed on the Corps of NCOs is critical. And I had an old Vietnam veteran tell me one time, he said, 3 things saved the United States Army after Vietnam. The first thing was education for the professional NCO Corps, to invest in these sergeants, because we had thousands of sergeants were killed in Vietnam and we had to rebuild this. And so the decision to invest in education for NCOs was one of the 3 keys. The second key was the creation of the National Training Center. And of course, what was special about the training center was that Blue 4, the friendly force that was there to train, routinely got crushed because the enemy force, the Op 4, lived there, and they were given free rein to create as much problem for the Blue 4. So in other words, you had a competitor that you had to learn and get better, and you had to do everything right to eventually be successful in that training center. And so this completely changed the mindset about training. And then the third piece was complemented that, and that was the AAR, the After Action Review, where people talk about what just happened, what did we do wrong, why did it go wrong, how do we fix it? And maybe a more academic way to say it, it would be critical self-reflection. And it usually starts off with the leader standing up and saying, okay, here's what I screwed up. Here's how we got to fix this. That changed the nature and the quality of our Army over the last several years. And so I think as Ukrainian land forces continue their modernization effort, and I know that General Mazhenko understood this when he was the chief of the general staff. I know there are so many veterans now fighting against the Russians that understand and appreciate this, but it does require a culture change. And one other aspect of a culture change that I would mention, and it was suggested by Doug Scott here, one of the people listening, is how we treat veterans. And when we talk about how veterans have to be treated, we're talking about employment opportunities after they have served, their health care after they have served, both from a psychological standpoint, but also from a physical standpoint, particularly if they've suffered terrible wounds or somehow disabled. And then, of course, they all have families. But if you can find meaningful employment for these soldiers who have served, typically you're going to get somebody that's already demonstrated qualities that any business would want to have. So it's not just about parades and medals and thanking them, it's about real tangible assistance for veterans. And that will also affect, of course, recruiting, because when young people see that veterans get used up in a conflict and then are cast to the side, why in the world would any young man or woman with a future want to be a part of a defense force that treats veterans that way? So I had to say those things up front because I was inspired by what Andre said and from Doug Scott's comment about how we treat veterans. I do believe that great power competition prevents great power conflict. And that's competition in the diplomatic space, the information space, the economic space, as well as in the military space, because this is where you demonstrate what your interests are. And if you demonstrate that something is of a strategic interest, and then you put resources and effort against it, that communicates to an adversary, in this case, the Kremlin, that you are interested. And if you don't demonstrate, if you're not willing to compete for it, then that also conveys, we're not going to do anything, help yourself. And I think that's what happened in the Black Sea region up until just a few years ago, that the United States and Western Europe did not convincingly demonstrate that this region was important to us. And so we see what happened. And that's why we've got to raise the profile and emphasize the strategic importance of the Black Sea region to the West and to defend those interests. Ukraine, of course, is not an island, but it is the keystone. I think when I look at the map, Ukraine is the keystone for the Black Sea region. And I think of the Black Sea region as the cauldron of competition, that this is the place, and it's all about Ukraine. This is the place where we have got to compete in all those domains that I talked about. The Kremlin should not be given the veto over whether or not Ukraine or Georgia joins NATO. Georgia should already be in NATO, and I'm convinced that Ukraine will become a part of NATO. So all that you're doing in Ukrainian land forces to become more and more compatible with NATO procedures, standards, modernization efforts, I think that is time and effort well spent. For sure, NATO membership for Ukraine is not around the corner. It's going to take time. But I was a lieutenant in Germany back in the 80s, and I remember thinking then, man, Germany is going to be divided into East and West forever. It'll be this way forever. But fortunately, the United States, the UK, and our other allies and the people of West Germany continued to believe in the eventual reunification, and it happened. So I think having a long-term vision about Crimea is strategically important. The fact that the United States never acknowledged or accepted or recognized the illegal annexation of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia is a good model, and we need to do the same thing with Crimea. Every single facet, any little local election that the Russians try to do there, ships that sail out of ports in Crimea should be declared contraband immediately. every single facet. This is what competition is all about. We declare that Crimea is not part of sovereign Russian territory. And we make sure that they are never able to put nuclear weapons into Crimea or use it to continue to expand it as the launching pad for all of its malign influence that it already does in Syria, the Caucasus and the Balkans, and now even into Libya. So I have a long-term view. And at the end of the day, it's going to be Ukrainian land forces and Ukrainian Navy forces that are going to have to take it back. And I believe that in my lifetime, I'm going to see Crimea back under Ukrainian sovereignty. Now, there's several things that we've got to do, though, to get there. I think that Ukraine and Romania have already established a good model for intelligence sharing and exercising together. It's going to take cooperation by all the Black Sea nations in all those spaces, and certainly land forces training together is a critical part of that. And Andre mentioned Jurkiw, the very large maneuver training area in southern Ukraine. I've learned about this from our friend Glenn Howard, so I've done some research, and I've talked to the Office of Defense Cooperation there in Kyiv. And they think that it's a long time before Jurkiw can become a true maneuver training center. It's going to take some investment in infrastructure to make sure that soldiers, units that go there have a place to live, that they can do maintenance there. This is very expensive, but if you're serious about improving and maintaining readiness for your land forces, you have to have a training center where they can go, and they're continuous rotation, and that just really wears out infrastructure. You have to invest in it, similar to what has already been done in Yavoriv. And I think Canada's contribution there cannot be overstated, how important it is that Canada continues to work alongside American forces there, working with our Ukrainian partners. Intelligence sharing is critical. We should never, ever get surprised in Ukraine by anything that the Kremlin does. If we are willing to share intelligence, forget who's in NATO and who's not in NATO, forget Five Eyes, get past that, change the policies as required so that Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria can all share intelligence with the United States, the UK, anybody else that's in the area, linking together all these different systems so that we have what General McChrystal used to call it the unblinking eye, a continuous eye on everything that's happening, what ships are moving, even those who have turned off their transponders, which we know happens a lot. There still are ways to track these vessels and aircraft that are in there. We should never be surprised. But if we don't string together and share intelligence, then we will have Ukrainian land forces that will be caught by surprise. Now, the second piece, when you look at the map, and I'm such an old person, I like having a map. My son thinks that the whole world fits in the palm of his hand in his iPhone, but I believe in maps. And by the way, Luke Coffey is one of the great map masters of the universe. When you have a map and you see that Ukraine could potentially has the advantage of interior lines. You've got Russia's in Crimea, in Donbas, and I'm afraid we're going to see them in Belarus here very soon, unfortunately. And then, of course, they have Russian peacekeepers in Transnistria. I love the old story about, I had a Polish friend tell me that Russian peacekeepers, they come in there and they keep a peace. So that's exactly what they've done in Transnistria. So Ukrainian land forces have got to be able to move as fast or faster than Russian forces could move. So that means we've got to take a hard look at transportation infrastructure, moving by road, moving by rail, moving large bulk supplies by river. Does Ukraine's infrastructure allow that sort of movement on interior lines to deal with, for sure, there will be multiple threats. They will not attempt to come in just one area, whether it's under the pretext of a humanitarian crisis in Crimea due to this alleged water shortage, or the need to bring in more peacekeepers in Transnistria, or some other explanation in Belarus. So and as General Mazhenko explained to me or pointed out to me, that Ukraine does not have enough land forces to cover the entire perimeter. So you're going to have to be able to move with rapid mobile forces to deal with that. And of course, you're going to have to be able to demonstrate that you can do that during exercises. So I think investment in transportation infrastructure is just as important to security for Ukraine as is investment in ships, modernization of equipment. Now, the last thing that I would highlight here, and because I'd love to listen to Luke Coffey more than myself, it is about exercises. I would love to see an exercise, and I can't take credit for this. This is Glenn Howard's idea, where a U.S. striker unit, rotational force that's in Romania, does a force march, wheel convoy from Romania all the way to the Cherokee Line training area in Ukraine. That would do 3 or 4 things. Number one, it would demonstrate commitment of the United States to Ukraine, even though it's not a NATO ally. The fact that we're practicing going there the way we have in other exercises, but to do it with land forces, similar to the Dragoon Ride exercises that we did when we brought the strikers home from Estonia all the way back to their base in Vilseck, Germany. But to do a movement like that would be such a clear, loud signal. Number two, it would also proof the lane. It would help us analyze how good is the infrastructure. Can we get there if we had to in a crisis? You don't want to find out during the crisis that you can't get there, that the bridge infrastructure is not adequate, or that the roads can't handle it. The third thing it would do, of course, it would be a wonderful example of how the United States Army trains junior leaders, how we test readiness and how we test maintenance. You don't know if your vehicles actually work unless you take them out for extended long-range movement. If you only do maintenance in the motor pool and you never drive out for extended periods of time, then actually you don't know whether or not you have maintenance. So this is part of how you develop a culture of readiness. And I know I'm looking at some of the names on here, General Clark, General Breedlove. These are some guys that have been dealing with how do you build and maintain readiness for a very long time. And it's not just about modernization, it's about doing those things that ensure you are ready. The final piece, I would love to see a combined Black Sea exercise where we take Ukraine's Sea Breeze exercise, the exercise we do in Georgia called Noble Partner, and then the exercise that we typically do in Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary called Saber Guardian, and tie them all together so that you've got a joint air, land, sea exercise. You're practicing missile defense. That would be a very challenging exercise to put together, but all the work that would be done to execute it would address so many of the challenges that we have, from mobility to missile defense to command and control to logistics. And if you're not serious about logistics, then you're not serious about warfighting. To do this exercise maybe every other year, I think would be a great way to improve not only Ukrainian land forces, but also the cooperation between all of us. Ambassador Courtney, sir, thanks for this. Walter, thanks for the chance to be a part of this. And I yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from Heritage.
Ben, thank you very much. That's really a terrific presentation. Luke.
Thank you. Thanks for those very kind words, General Hodges. This is the first time I've ever been praised as a cartographer. So perhaps I have a second career in my future. I want to thank Walter also and his team for putting together this event. It's an honor to be here to speak. It's such an important issue. It's particularly great to talk about the land domain. I think sometimes we put too much focus on the maritime domain when we talk about the Black Sea and the Black Sea region. And I myself, I'm very guilty of that as well. And I've been actively trying to shift some of my writings and some of my focus on the land component, the land domain, as it pertains to the broader Black Sea region and the security of the Black Sea. In terms of the specific topic today about the land forces and readiness of land forces. We've already heard from two great speakers, a lot of detail, some great suggestions by both. I will focus my remarks on 4 specific areas, and I'll have probably a heavier focus on NATO. But I want to first talk about training and the importance of training and how we might enhance and modify how the US and our allies, Canada, the Brits, and other NATO countries train the Ukrainian military. I remember as a young Army officer, we were always told you have to train how you fight. In Ukraine, they have to train while they fight. And this is a big difference. And I think that the US and our allies perhaps should look at how we're training the Ukrainian forces, where we're training the Ukrainian forces, and see after so many years of this conflict, if we should continue down the same path or perhaps add additional opportunities or additional ways to train the Ukrainian land forces. For example, Yavoriv Training Center is about 10 miles from Poland, from the Polish border. It's about 700 miles from the front lines in Luhansk and Donetsk. And it's my understanding that US trainers, for example, cannot or not supposed to operate or train east of the Dnieper River. So this limits our ability to serve as mentors and to get our own on-the-ground understanding of how the situation is, so then we can tailor and create our training packages better for the Ukrainians. I think back in 2015, 2016, this probably made a lot of sense, this restriction on the location of US forces. The front lines weren't as static. There was a lot of uncertainty as to what was going on. But fast forward to 2020, we have a very static, linear front line that is, for all intents and purposes, stabilized. And I think that there should be some consideration or some possibility of more U.S. eyes and boots on the ground closer to the front lines, serving as mentors or getting a better understanding of the training needs in the region. And General Hodges did talk about the importance of logistics. And I just wanted to add to that by saying, when you look at the size of Ukraine, to have that mobile force that can move around the country, it actually requires an expeditionary capability. You're talking 700 or 800 miles from one side of the country to the other. That's that's the same distance I checked as going from Paris to northern Algeria. So you have to have that flexible and expeditionary capability, which I think it's improving, but I think it's a problem for many of our allies and partners that are already inside NATO. Speaking of NATO, I do think NATO has a special role, and we were talking about earlier about the importance of after-action reviews and lessons learned, and tapping into all of that experience, that frontline experience, that combat experience that Ukrainian soldier, NCO, and officer gets from their rotations onto the front lines. And how do we retain this and this institutional knowledge, and how do we better share it with our NATO allies and NATO partners? I have proposed for a while now that NATO certifies a hybrid warfare center of excellence in Ukraine. There is already a hybrid warfare center of excellence that is joint EU and NATO, and it's in Helsinki, Finland, and it does important work. However, it's not certified by NATO, and no non-EU or non-NATO country can participate in the Center of Hybrid Warfare Center of Excellence. which is very curious to me, considering that the countries that are on the front lines of Russian hybrid warfare, like Ukraine or Georgia, for example, that the countries that we could learn the most from aren't allowed to participate in the hybrid center of excellence in Finland. And there's never been a NATO certified center of excellence outside of a NATO country. But I've looked into this, and there's no legal obstacle to this. It's a matter of initiative and political will. And it would be another way for not only NATO countries to learn the lessons from Ukraine about hybrid warfare, but also to give Ukraine a leadership role on that specific issue for the alliance, and a way to get another way to get a NATO flag and the flags of NATO members flying literally in Ukraine if such a center could be created. At the Warsaw Summit in July of 2016, the NATO-Ukraine platform on countering hybrid warfare was established, and it was this mechanism between NATO and the Ukraine to do this understanding and sharing of lessons learned and tactics about hybrid warfare. But I think it's time maybe to take this to the next step. And in addition to taking this to the next step and perhaps hitting the refresh button on that NATO-Ukraine platform on countering hybrid warfare back from 2016, we should also, I think, conduct a review of NATO's trust funds. These trust funds were established in 2014, right when the fighting really kicked off. It was at the Wales Summit. There are 6 of these NATO trust funds. They cover issues of counter IED training, military medicine and healthcare, transition of service personnel into civilian life, for example. There are others. There are 6 in total. We've had a problem with these. They've never really been fully funded. Most of these 6 NATO trust funds you don't hear much about at all anymore. And I'm wondering, in the year 2020, how applicable are some of these trust funds that were developed in 2014? Perhaps now is an opportunity for NATO to review this and maybe swap out some of these initiatives that are in this one of the 6 trust funds, and focus at least in part on how to improve Ukraine's land forces. And then the final point where I think that the US and NATO can help improve Ukraine's land forces is actually sort of one of my out of the box thinking out loud ideas. Perhaps after the important meeting between President Zelensky and President Erdogan, and all the messaging coming out of the Turkish-Ukrainian relationship, maybe this is an opportunity for the US and Turkey to cooperate more closely to help focus on Ukraine's armed forces and Ukraine's defensive capabilities. And this could simultaneously serve as a confidence building measure between Washington, D.C. and Ankara. This is an area that both the US and Turkey agree on. There are admittedly fewer and fewer of these areas in recent years, but this is one. Policymakers from both sides should latch on to this and see if there's any synergy that could be developed between the US and Turkey on improving the security situation and improving the capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces. And in conclusion, I will say that the ultimate driver for reforms in Ukraine, whether it is economic reform, governance reform, security sector reform, reform of the armed forces, those reforms will be paved on the road to NATO membership. And the US and NATO, I think, need to do a better job at articulating how this path will work to NATO membership. It's not going to happen overnight, as Ben said. It's going to be a process and not an event, but we cannot allow the slightly open door of NATO to slowly close without giving the Ukrainians some hope and optimism. And I think maybe it's as a more general statement for NATO enlargement, I think maybe it's time for NATO to review some of its tools that it uses. I think the Membership Action Plan, for example, was a great tool when you were talking about easier, less complex issues in Eastern Europe in terms of enlargement. But is the Membership Action Plan the best tool to bring a country like Georgia or Ukraine into NATO? Or even with the challenges with Bosnia and Herzegovina? I don't think so. I think that we need a very tailored and specific approach to each of these aspirant countries to get them across the finish line. And we have to stop trying to standardize the process. So I will end there. Again, thank you, Walter, for inviting me here to speak. And thank you to your team for organizing this great event.
Luke, thanks very much. That's very helpful and very hopeful as well. So let me encourage folks to ask questions. We have two thus far. You can do this through the chat box. James Scher has the first question, and then Irina Cullen through the Q&A function has the second question. And both of those are for General Hodges. Let me first ask the question of Minister Zaharodniuk. When the changes in the government took place this spring, since then there has been a general perception in the West that the government has slowed its reforms. Is this the case in defense, or are defense reforms moving ahead the way they have been before?
It's a tricky question for me to answer, to be honest.
I know.
You probably should ask General Hodges, I believe, or somebody else, because it's not good for me to be too criticizing or whatever. Well, I can tell you for sure that some of them definitely, majority of them certainly are not stopping. So there's like a program, and this program didn't change. And from what was in the program, we clearly see reports that number of things happen. So yeah, we cannot say that everything has stopped, and I don't believe that would be true. Some of them needs, like for example, we passed a procurement law. That could be a good example. I mean, the procurement law for defense procurement, it's been passed in the summertime, and it requires a very serious number of the lower level sort of regulations and so on. There's been some questions on where that goes so far, and there's a debate whether it's moving in the right direction or it's moving in the wrong direction and so on. So that needs some kind of attendance. But generally, on the military side, there hasn't been. I mean, the change of the government didn't impact that, I believe. So we will see the progress. Hope that works.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Minister. James Scher has the first question. James, I can read it if you like, or if you want to ask it live, that's fine as well.
I can ask it live.
Okay.
Way to say hello to everyone as well. Look, as the panelists know, the US and the UK have inhibitions about sharing important operational intelligence and even political intelligence with some NATO allies. Now, it's no secret to anyone that there is in Ukraine's armed forces and in Georgia's every attempt on the part of the GRU to maintain an agentura, an agent network. There are people who emerge as long-term agents. And so the question obviously arises, how, Ben, can we act on this proposal of intelligence sharing without taking unusually high risks of critical information immediately going to Russian GRU and other agencies? What is this doable?
And who this question is for? It's to?
Mainly for Ben. It's for Ben. But I'd be delighted. I'd be delighted, Andrei, if you also care to answer it.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take a swing at it. James, you're exactly right, of course. There are no doubt would be leaks, just as there are even from, I mean, occasionally you hear about an Estonian officer that's rounded up, or in other European countries, and by the way, even in the United States. So no doubt, excuse me, there is that risk of a leak. But I think that, you know, Germany is not Five Eyes, but yet we have a very good intelligence sharing, bilateral intelligence sharing arrangement with Germany for counterterrorism and trafficking and other things. There is a very good intelligence sharing arrangement between the United States and Romania, not Five Eyes. So I'm not talking about nuclear codes. What I am talking about, though, is stringing together, fusing together the capabilities of satellite imagery, land-based surveillance systems, so that in various command posts, whether they're in Ukraine, Romania, in Tbilisi, Georgia, where watch staffs can see what's happening, to maintain constant surveillance, much like we tried to do in Afghanistan, where you had all the different aerostats, and eventually to link together all the different cameras so that you could see the whole picture, which is what you would find, by the way, at every major intersection around any major city. You string together capabilities. And I just think that, that's a little bit oversimplified, but this doesn't require major breakthroughs on intel sharing to fuse together those kind of capabilities. I would also say it is the tendency of intelligence experts to overemphasize protecting sources, and so when they write their reports, they're unreadable by anybody except somebody that has the galactic level security clearance. So often, if you just do basic disciplined intelligence staff work, where the reports are written for release, and that's a matter of training, then a lot more information is available. Bottom line, I think Ukraine and Georgia will know more about what the heck is going on in the region than the United States and the UK will know in 1,000 years, no matter how many satellites we have there. So that's what I'm anxious to tap into.
Okay, thank you. Let's go. Irina Cohen has a question in the Q&A. General Hodges, what message does taking U.S. troops out of Germany send to the Kremlin? And how does that impact the security of Ukraine and other East European countries?
Well, of course, in normal circumstances, the Department of Defense and each of the combatant commands and the Joint Staff are continuously reviewing force structure, because the United States absolutely does not have enough air, land, sea, special forces, all these capabilities. There's just not enough. So it would have been normal in other circumstances that we would review this. I remember U.S. Army Europe was getting smaller and smaller. The last two armor brigades went home before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this kind of process would normally be normal. In this case, is a terrible mistake. It was an absolute gift to the Kremlin. It was a political decision that was made before any strategic analysis was made. None of the U.S. commanders anywhere in Europe knew that this was coming. And so now they're having to do it in reverse, to figure out, okay, how do we meet? It's a legal order, by the way, so they have to figure out how to do it. And I watched on July 29th when the secretary and the commure, SACURE, and the vice chairman had to deliver the concept. And General Hyten, the vice chairman, who's a heck of a very good officer, said, well, this is not actually a plan, it's a concept. And I think everybody in uniform has been saying it's going to take months to plan and years to execute, because obviously the Congress has a role, and the price tag on some of these moves is absolutely staggering. To move from EUCOM, for example, to shape. Now, General Breedlove could explain this much better than I could, but I think these were not the results of normal strategic analysis or the interagency process. The Congress was caught by surprise, and the Congress has already said that the department is not going to be able to use any 2021 money to execute any of these moves. The thing that struck me the most and was most concerning about what Secretary Espers, when he gave his, when he briefed the concept, and look, these are very professional men. There's no doubt they're going to do their absolute best to carry out a legal order. They're going to do their best to identify and mitigate the risk and try and make it work. But the fact when he listed the 5 priorities for doing this, that readiness was not one of the 5 priorities. I think that was the first time I've ever heard a Secretary of Defense speak on any kind of force structure situation and not highlight that this is going to improve readiness, because it absolutely will not improve readiness when you move the decisions that the Air Force is having to make to accommodate all this. None of that is going to help in my view. And certainly when you take away the only forward stationed combat arms unit, the 2nd Stryker Cavalry Regiment, if you're going to take it out from U.S. Army Europe, then that means the commander of U.S. Army Europe has no teeth that he owns of his own. He's completely dependent on rotational forces from the States for armor, infantry, and artillery. And the Army has just made the decision to prioritize op tempo over readiness. And one of the ways they're going to do that is to no longer have heel to toe rotations, but instead the rotations will be shorter, and you're going to have 3 or 4 month gaps in between the rotation of U.S. Army land forces in Europe once this starts. So that's another reason not to turn loose of the Stryker Regiment. So to finally get around and answering Irina's question, the message to the Kremlin is Merry Christmas.
And if I may add to that, Ambassador Courtney, there's a lot of talk about how this is going to improve our presence in the Black Sea region and perhaps the Baltic region, but we don't even know where these forces are returning to in CONUS back in the US. But yet we're already talking about them now rotating back to Europe. So we're talking, if this does happen, we're talking years down the line. And presumably in terms of readiness and cost and logistics and the strain on soldiers' families and soldiers' time, it would be far better to if we need more rotational forces in the Black Sea region, then presumably rotating them from Germany would be a better way to go about it. I see in the comments that someone asked about the advantages and disadvantages of forward deployment of U.S. troops from Germany to countries such as Poland and Romania. Yeah, of course. I mean, there are huge benefits to having this U.S. rotational force going from Germany to Poland or Romania, as Ben talked about the with the proposed road march from Romania into southern Ukraine. You learn a lot about your equipment that works, your equipment that doesn't work, what you need to do to maintain that equipment, keep it ready for a big move. And every time that a U.S. soldier rotates from Germany to Poland or Germany to Romania or wherever, they learn all of these lessons. Every time a soldier leaves the base and goes to a range, they learn this lesson. So this is fantastic stuff. But we shouldn't pretend that rotating forces from the U.S. to Romania or anywhere else in the Black Sea region can be a viable substitute from having the U.S. forces permanently based in Europe and in a place like Germany.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for answering that question. There are 2 other questions. I'll ask them both together and then ask all 3 of you to answer as you like, and also to make any final remarks. We have about 10 minutes left in our session. So one of the questions is from an anonymous attendee to the minister. Do you find that a large portion of the population is suffering from war fatigue? And if so, how is this affecting military, and how is the government addressing the issue? The second question is from Michael Ritzak, and says basically, Lieutenant General Hodges is right about intelligence sharing. He says, I wonder if we would need to establish a multinational force intelligence command in Europe for the purpose of Russian-Ukrainian war and related intelligence information. So those are the final questions. Minister, why don't you go first, then General Hodges, and then Luke.
Okay. Obviously, there is a fatigue, obviously, and we have to understand that this war wasn't started by Ukrainian people. I mean, they're tired of it. It impacts economy, it impacts morale. It's a substantial issue, of course. At the same time, this is exactly the consequence the Russians are trying to exploit. So they in all their like a big puzzle of the hybrid strategies, they obviously including that people want the war to be over. Our president mentioned many times that this is one of his priorities, and people like that. The thing is that he clearly understands, and Mr. Danilov, when he was speaking, he clearly said that there is no way that means that Ukraine should do it on its own account and basically to its disadvantage, because essentially in this case this is like losing, and this is exactly what Russia would love to see. So we clearly have to understand that we're dealing with the civilizational threat, and from our perspective, this is a country which does not want to see Ukraine existing in NATO, in Europe, and basically as a democracy, as I said in the beginning. That's their strategy. So we have to live with this, and we have to understand that we don't know for how long we have to fight, but we need to realize that we need to survive through these circumstances, and that's what we're doing so far. So yeah, I mean, and it does not impact land forces. It doesn't impact the armed forces. They're still strong. They're still motivated. They realize all these things. So I don't believe that it reaches to them. But yeah, generally it's an issue which we have to deal with on a kind of daily basis. And there are many countries. Well, there are some countries and there's some politicians in Europe, particularly, which would love to see this whole thing settled somehow. Settled quickly and somehow with some sort of compromise, not necessarily which supports Ukrainian sort of strategic goals and objectives. So basically we have to deal with this as well. We have to explain to some of the leaders or some of the politicians that keeping Ukraine fighting, it's not like we have nothing better to do. It's just because if we don't do that, and if we go to some quick solution or some quick deal, it will actually make things worse. They just don't realize it yet. But well, some of them do. Sometimes, unfortunately, not. But it's a game which is like much bigger than east of Ukraine. So that's a quick or not quick answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, General Hodges.
Two quick points. First, to the suggestion of some sort of intelligence headquarters or fusion headquarters. I don't like separating intelligence from operations from commanders. I mean, the important part is to be able to integrate those things so that you have a full picture of what's going on, and you're anticipating and you're operating based on what will always be a changing environment. So I don't think I'd favor a specific standalone intel headquarters. However, I do think that if NATO elevates the Black Sea region in priority so that we have some sort of coherence along NATO's eastern flank. You know, we've got an enhanced forward presence in the north and tailored forward presence in the south. But actually, I think the Black Sea region is that cauldron of competition that is even more important strategically to the Kremlin than is the Baltic region. Then we need a core headquarters, a 3-star joint headquarters, not a core headquarters, but a 3-star joint headquarters where everybody in the morning wakes up smelling Black Sea air. And I think probably Romania is the place where it should go. But it would include officers and staff from Ukraine and Georgia as well. And this is where intelligence would be fused, exercises would be coordinated, the logistics would be organized, all the things necessary to fight and to demonstrate that you can fight in that region. And if you demonstrate that you can do it, then the chances of actually having to do it go way down. To the question about, are the Ukrainian people tired of war? You know, the United States is, I'm sure they are, by the way, the United States has been in Afghanistan for 19 years. I mean, that blows me away. We're still there in 19 years, and in Iraq, 18 years. But I think it's too long, especially if our political leaders are not able to explain why. And I think in Ukraine, if the elected officials, not people in uniform, elected officials have to explain to their own populations why we're doing this, why it's necessary. And it can't be platitudes. It's got to be hardcore. Let me tell you why we're going to raise your taxes. Because we have to pay to make sure we can defend freedom of navigation. We have to make sure we can defend critical infrastructure. We have to make sure we can protect our own citizens. And this is what it's going to take to do that. And I think we made a huge mistake in the United States by not raising taxes to pay for these deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. I guarantee you, if you raise taxes specifically to pay for going to war, then everybody will pay attention, and we will not be there 19 years later without the president of any administration having to explain why.
We used to say that about our war in Vietnam. Luke.
Yeah, the only thing I want to add maybe is on the intelligence sharing point. I know we've really touched on almost every angle about this issue, but since it seems to be a popular one, I'll give my 2 cents. Perhaps this is an area where I talked about the NATO trust funds. If the handling of classified information by Ukrainian officials or the sharing of this classified information by NATO officials to Ukrainian officials is a bottleneck in the cooperation, then maybe one of the new trust funds should be on education and training on how to properly handle the classified information and how to store it and how to use it. To follow on with what Ben said about the sources of intelligence, this is actually what normally makes a particular piece of intelligence so highly classified if it is classified at a high level. It's how the information was derived. And certainly there are ways that you can share information and take the source information out. And maybe that's something that we need to do a better job at. And also, I think this is more of an anecdotal observation, but we need to make sure that we have the right caveats on the intelligence that we use and we want to share. Because I've been in briefings before that have said, you know, working with the U.S. military, it was secret, no foreign. Working with the Brits and their Ministry of Defense, it was UK eyes only. And, you know, someone would ask, well, where this information come from? And the British officer would say, oh, the Americans. And then the immediate question back would be, well, why does it say UK eyes only? And then the answer is usually something along the lines of, well, that was on the PowerPoint slide, that was on the template, that was the standard caveat that was on there on the template, and it's just not changed. And once something has that sort of caveat attached to it, then it's almost impossible to get that off. So I think we perhaps need to do a better job at making sure that intelligence that is useful to our friends and allies is accurately caveated in a responsible and accurate way.
Luke, thank you very much. We have just 2 minutes left. Walter, you passed along a question. I couldn't exactly understand it. Could you just explain briefly what it is? You need to unmute.
Yeah, it was given to me. It was passed to me on my phone, and then I tried to pass it and didn't go through on chat, or it didn't go through on question and answers. It essentially was something about enhanced NATO partnership. How would that impact the Ukrainian land forces moving forward? How would that, the status that has been given to Ukraine?
Yes, Mr. Minister.
Yeah, it's just there are a number of instruments which we can use. It's a better exchange of intelligence. It's a participation of the officers in the various roles permanent in NATO, various headquarters in various places. It's opening excellence centers, like was just mentioned by Luke concerning the hybrid, for example, which is an excellent idea. I believe it's a more intense participation in missions and exercises, and basically setting up centers.
Hi.
Which would
I called because you maybe haven't seen the email from Nick.
Go ahead. I've muted Ambassador.
Yeah. And it's obviously setting up the centers like Ben suggested for the Black Sea, where the parties can develop scenarios and a very clear action plans on each of these scenarios. So when something happens or is about to happen, there is already a plan how to proact on, how to react on this without like deciding what to do when bad things happen. Because what is the problem is that when Russians are extremely, and obviously I'm thinking that way, they're extremely innovative. They are coming up always with some new ideas, and we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, and we should. And so basically there must be a sort of a war gaming, and the plans on if they do this, then we do that. If we do this, then we do that, and so on. So setting up a center which would work on these scenarios would tremendously increase the safety in the Black Sea, for example. So setting up things like that will obviously impact the stability in Ukraine itself. It will bring it closer to NATO, but also will I believe it will raise the safety of, security of all the region. If I may, there is one very important point. NATO is currently developing a strategy for 2030. So there is a reflection process which will end up with some sort of a vision for 2030. And Ukraine has to be somehow, Ukraine's position shouldn't be frozen in these documents. So it shouldn't mention that, okay, it's a partner and that's it, because it will be treated by many as it's a partner for the next 10 years. And there is no chance of membership or anything like that. I understand this document cannot cannot promise the membership because it's obviously a different process for that. But at least it should keep the door open, and it should keep the understanding that there is a membership possibility subject to some circumstances and so on. But not to freeze the situation as it is. And it should allow to extend the cooperation as much as possible. And that's could be a good vehicle like this strategy or the which is currently being developed as the vehicle for that sort of thinking.
Thank you very much. We had a great discussion, very substantive today, very specific, focused on ground forces and Ukraine's defense situation. Let me first apologize to those who asked questions and really couldn't get to them. One person asked a question about a naval matter, but that's the next panel. So let's give a hand to all of our speakers today. This is the way we do it. Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you, Walter.
Thank you. And I just, while everybody's still on, I wanted to say that as I had promised, this is going to be as good as anything we've ever done. The 4 aces we just saw, and I just said to myself, I've been dealt 4 aces on this one, 4 aces on the one coming up, and then 4 more aces twice next in the next session next tomorrow. And I simply just wanted to ask General Hodges if I can borrow that wonderful phrase, the cauldron of competition. I've got a funny feeling it's going to be the way I heard my old prof, Zbigniew Brzezinski, once used the arc of crisis, and I never thought that it was going to become a very famous phrase. I think this cauldron of competition, sir, I will give you copyright on it because I think it's a very important one for the Baltic Sea. And talk about the Baltic Sea, what a segue to the Baltic Sea, because the very next question is going to deal with if by sea, taking measure of Ukraine's maritime forces, and they so happen to be on the Black Sea. Again, I want to thank Minister Andrei Zaornyuk. I now know why Mike Carpenter couldn't find a place for himself last March. He really missed you, and everybody continues to miss you. General Ben Hodges is a mainstay for all of this, and I just hope he can come to our future events. Luke, as always, you've been a mainstay throughout all these years, and I'm grateful for what you've done and are doing and will be doing. And I also want to thank Ambassador Courtney, as always, a first-rate, not only moderator but panelist, someone who always contributes to our discussion. So again, all four of you, thank you, sir. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, James, it's about to be now your turn. I hope we have, just very quickly, the moderator will be James Shearer of both Chatham House and now senior fellow at the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute. Many of you know Professor Shearer. He is probably one of the finest analysts in the world, not just in the UK, but in the world on issues related to Ukraine, basically to the Eastern European vector of things. And then with him, it'll be Admiral Ihor Kabonenko. It will be Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, who will be joining us right after he finishes his other webinar. And he's promised us that he will be here in about 15 minutes. And then the lead discussant, as always, a wonderful analyst, all these years, someone who runs a wonderful foundation, Mr. Glenn Howard, president of Jamestown Foundation. Okay, James, it's all yours. Sorry about the long introduction.
Thank you, Walter. Greetings from Tallinn. It's afternoon for most of you. It's 7:45 here, as it is in Ukraine. If Minister Zaornyuk is still with us, we're not only on the same wavelength, we're on the same time zone. Ukraine needs a navy. Since 2014, Russia has been proceeding methodically, aggressively, and of course lawlessly to transform the Black Sea into a unipolar zone. And that includes the reapportionment of maritime territory and of highly valuable maritime assets belonging to Ukraine. Many of you are became aware of the saliency of these issues, not only in 2014, but were reminded in November 2018 in the Sea of Azov, this horrible episode. But fewer are possibly aware of the fact that in July last year, Russian naval exercises closed off 1/4 of the entire Black Sea to shipping. And therefore, there was a political message as well as a military purpose behind this. Now, the practical issue, which I'm sure will be discussed amongst others, is given a commitment to address the challenge of creating a Ukrainian navy, how are priorities and how is progress to be measured? To those who judge these things on the basis of brochures and military almanacs, this is about the provision of new and modern ships, armament, the increase of resources, service personnel, and so on. To serious experts like those on this panel, the issue is at least as much about coherence, or the absence of it, how the parts fit into the whole, how training systems, command structures, force planning, resource provision, their intelligent management and accountability come together. And of course, in the end, most important, support a naval and defense strategy. So here to address this, as our host already mentioned, are three exceptionally qualified individuals. The first, I've had the privilege to know since 2014, is Admiral Igor Kabanenko, who has served as a professional naval officer, at least until 2014, since 1983 in both the Soviet and Ukrainian navies. In the Ukrainian Navy, had a number of senior appointments before becoming finally Deputy Minister of Defense for European integration. And he is now the president of the well-respected Ukrainian Advanced Research Project Agency. Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, a very seasoned US naval officer who completed 30 years as a nuclear-trained surface combatant warfare officer, retiring in 2017, has held a number of ship, squadron, and flag appointments, and he is currently director of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation and a senior fellow at the Foundation of Defense and Democracies. And our discussant, Glenn Howard, has long been a recognized expert in the South Caucasus. He is proficient in Azerbaijani and Arabic. He is also a fluent Russian speaker. He had been an analyst at Science Applications International, and for a number of years now has served as the president of the Jamestown Foundation, whose Eurasia Daily Monitor is for serious specialists, including myself, of course, an indispensable research tool. So with that, I will hand the floor over to Admiral Kabanenko.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for introduction. First of all, let me pass my sincere thanks to Dr. Walter Zaritsky, all webinar coordinators for invitation. It's my privilege and pleasure to take part in this important event. I'm glad also to see all panelists. I think Admiral Mark Montgomery will attend us soon. So also, I'm glad to see attenders of this panel. From my perspective, we would like to comprehensively assess of the Ukraine's human resources to defend our state at sea. We should do this based on the strategy of the naval forces of Ukraine up to 2035, which was signed in 2018. This strategy was based in accordance with the leading NATO methodology, .MLPF, and I think it's would be good if I will base my speech in analysis how this elements of this methodology were implemented in our naval forces. Let's start with doctrine. Creation of new doctrinal framework of the naval forces according to the NATO standards is the basis of the Euro-Atlantic integration process at the level of national fleet declared by the law. NATO doctrines of the AGP series allied joint publications, in particular for maritime operations, the doctrine AGP 3.1 Allied Joint Doctrine for Maritime Operations have been implemented in the Ukrainian Navy. Employment of ships and units of the naval forces are based on tactical NATO guidelines. Thanks to our American colleagues and other partners' assistance of these important changes. Let me stress what doctrinal interoperability with NATO is very important for Ukraine's Navy because maritime operational environment. But language issue is still on the agenda. Command of the Naval Forces of Ukraine doesn't have enough communication skills to use the NATO standards in their original language. Particularly, this needs to be done to ensure their full operational interoperability with NATO member states' forces. In this regard, multinational naval operational training center could be a good solution of both problems: NATO operational standards implementation, as well as to improve personnel's skills on operational English. Such training center existed in Sevastopol, but we lost it after Crimea occupation by Russia. This functionality could be installed in the Navy Education and Training Center located in Mykolaiv. Organizationally important naval transformation already have been done. Naval command's functions were divided between the two vertical lines for generation and operational employment. As this allow improving the service efficiency, this very good, very famous NATO practice implemented in Ukraine. Ukraine Navy HQ functionality was identified as bemanning, training, equipment, daily sustainment, and readiness to execute assigned tasks by fleet units. Maritime Operational Center was created for carrying out naval and amphibious operations in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Marines formation structural change allowed to provide planned troops rotations in battlefield and needed post-rotation training based on getting combat experience. All of these changes are good. There are good achievements. But one important thing left out of the reform: Navy representation was not established at the strategic level in Kyiv. So the national fleet development still continues to be in the hand of Kyiv authorities. And this is still evidence of traditional continental mentality of Ukraine's political military elite. Next is training, very important element. Naval officers training is conducted at the Naval Academy located in Odessa, the National Defense University in Kyiv, as well as educational institutions of the NATO member states. Training of NCOs is taking place at the Naval Education and Training Center in Mykolaiv. It should be noted that NATO tactical guidelines implementation in Ukraine's naval educational programs is ongoing process. I would stress what joint NATO-led and the US-led naval exercises, famous sea breeze drills, and others in the Black Sea region bring good joint combat training. It's a good level, really good level, and a lot of positive feedbacks. It helps to exchange knowledge and practical combat experience between participants. In this regard, a lot of potential for joint multinational forces trainings could be provided by Shirokolaevsky training range, which has a very good facilities for joint exercises up to brigade level. In accordance with naval strategy, leadership and education component aim to create military leaders eligible to lead in combat environment based on NATO principle approaches and values. Most important here is military mentality changes from a one-track mind to creative initiative, training a new generation of highly skilled proactive service members with developed leadership qualities. I've been told that personnel graduated from national and Western military leadership and education courses quite often meet misunderstanding of the leadership role and place when they come back to Ukrainian Navy. It means at least two things: domination of vertical subordination, so-called командування, and not clear conjunction between job description and real-life daily routine. Our officers who've got experience to serve in NATO HQ and other NATO military structures will know what job descriptions there are very precise, will explain what should be done by officer or NCO during his service time and what benefits will be available. Unfortunately, it is not the same in Ukraine. Our job descriptions are still based on former Soviet traditions. A lot of blurry formulations, not clear obligations, and poor human rights inside. This reduces personnel's internal motivation and satisfaction from their military service. Let's further speak about personnel development. This component gives understanding about career management, assessment procedures, and personnel promotion. The naval strategy declares what a change in personnel management system should begin at the first stage of the strategy implementation by creating military service recruiting system to form new personnel potential of the Navy. Full support of the service members' career will make the profession of a naval sailor prestigious, will motivate to stay on military service, and will influence the problem of personnel loss. Really good provisions, really good, but needs strong military will to implement it and effective efforts. Unfortunately, reality is not so good enough. More than 77,000 professional servicemen left the Ukraine's armed forces in 2018-2020. This is almost the third part of the armed forces of Ukraine. 20,000 from this number left troops in the first 9 months of this year. By comparison, only 2,600 of military personnel were freed from the armed forces in 2016. Quite essential number of retired skilled naval officers and the NCOs are among them. Several reasons why does it exist. One of them is what the personnel management is still based on former Soviet Union model. More personal devotion to the senior boss opinion than personal professional skills and service achievements are decisive in the Ukraine's officer's career. This kills smart initiative, motivation, and creates a fear of decision making on different levels of chain of command. Annual assessments practice is still far from the Western standards. Its outcomes are not available for observation by all personnel. Appointment on new positions in accordance with annual assessment ratings is not become the strong rule. Quite often promotion does not match with results of operational task accomplishment and operational combat training. It means that career management weakly tied to personnel's skills. Unfortunately, NCOs have not taken all of the sailors, management, and commanding officers still serve in framework of former Soviet approach. Officer is responsible for everything. A lot has been done. It's clear. It's in fact. A lot has been done to train professional NCOs in Ukrainian Navy, but NCOs naval community will appear when they take clear tasks, authority, and divide it with officers' responsibility. It depends on top persons of military chain of command. One more important is material and facilities. Ukraine is facing enormous maritime threats created by Russia near Ukraine's coastline at the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. In this situation, Ukraine's naval personnel urgently needs to keep in its hands robust naval platforms for deterrence and adequate response at sea. Look on the US Mark VI fast combat boats. They are technologically advanced, based on real human-machine synergy for defense purposes. These and other combat platforms proposed our partners for Ukraine are not the same as former Soviet Union ships and boats still existing in the naval forces of Ukraine. It should be noted that Mosquito Fleet defined it as priority in the Ukraine's naval strategy. These boats' advantage over larger ships is ability of agile and surprise actions, possibility to be relocated by land and air, and the ability to operate in the sea-river nodes. Such fast maneuverable platforms with little weapon on board has huge operational potential. It can be realized only if naval personnel will possess needed skills. It should be reflected in naval personnel policy. In this regard, the future naval servicemen requirements created by the Ukraine's Navy staff, comprehensive vision how to bring together needed personnel's moral, leadership and character, professional skills and motivation, which directly connects with facilities for naval personnel stationing and training, should be implemented as soon as possible. So recovery of Ukraine's naval potential is not possible without naval personnel of new generation, which deadly required military culture and career management policy changing, robust naval capabilities, and personnel's motivation. Let me end on this. I open for your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Admiral Kabanenko, thank you very much for that cogent and compelling statement. I'm delighted to say, at least it's been suggested to me, that Admiral, I see him now, Admiral Montgomery, whom I have already introduced, is now here with us. Thank you so much for proceeding straight from another web discussion to this one. I'm delighted to welcome you, Sir Admiral. The floor is yours.
Hey, thank you very much, sir. And thanks for the opportunity to be here. I feel like a reliever brought in from the bullpen, to use an American analogy. Let's hope I can pitch a little better than the Tampa Rays pitchers did last night out of the bullpen. We'll see how it goes. And it's a real honor to follow Admiral Kabanenko, someone who I've met and talked with several times, and be here with Glenn Howard. I do admit, every time Admiral Kabanenko has to say, we still have a Soviet model, I cringe a little bit. Now, if you were to say it was about electronic warfare, I'd be pretty happy, but almost anything else, I cringe, especially with personnel management. Now look, I haven't worked directly on Ukraine for 5 to 7 years since I left U.S. European Command, but I have worked closely with countries in the Pacific pressured by an authoritarian, revanchist government who used gray zone tactics and overwhelming military advantage to challenge the sovereignty of neighbors and attempt to coerce illegal actions. So, which is to say, pretty much very similar environment to what Ukraine experiences with Russia, as what some of our Southeast Asian countries and Taiwan have experienced with China over the last 5 to 7 years. But when I came back to working in the U.S. Senate for Senator McCain and here at the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission, I have had the chance to study the challenges for the Ukrainian Navy in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. And I try to think about it in two layers. And I don't speak for U.S. European Command here. This is purely myself. I think the Ukrainian Navy has to absolutely focus on the immediate term and the midterm, and understand that these two things are integrated with each other, and you're going to have to take risks today to be ready tomorrow, and that's challenging. But what I say is today they have 3 risks. The first is, 3 tasks. The first is to establish situational awareness in their immediate territorial waters and in their EEZ, just situational awareness. The second is to be able to protect their sovereignty in their immediate territorial waters. And the third is to procure the force needed to be ready for the midterm actions. Now, look, that is not a large bin of tasks, right? But it's going to be very challenging. And so then once you say, okay, those are our tasks, what are the tools we require? And here's where I think, the hard work comes. The first set of tools we're going to need are surveillance assets, the mobile land-based radars, and coming soon to the Black Sea near you, maritime UAVs. And really there you have to balance capability versus cost. There's some high-end US systems that would be fantastic. You would also get one. And then there's some Turkish systems as they begin to marinize their UAV that I think can give you some real opportunity. But what do you need? There are some minimum things for those immediate term tasks that you have to have from your surveillance asset. You need to have real-time communications. You need to have a mission package camera, and if you're lucky, a maritime radar. And obviously, most of these, as I remember, the Turkish drone can carry about 55 kilos, about 120 pounds. So you're going to get either or. You have to have persistence. You want to have it be able to be up there a while so you don't have to have too many of them. You have to have ease of maintenance and operability. We all know why. And the discussion of the changeover in the personnel that the Ukrainian Navy goes through is exactly indicative of why you want to keep that maintenance and operability easy. The question of armed, I don't think that's a question today that they have to address. And I think this leaves you with Turkish and US models. And, I would, I don't work for any companies, but I would probably bias myself towards a Turkish model right now, only because you get the persistence, the numbers, the ease of maintenance and operability. I'm afraid if you go to the US system, you'll end up having to buy US contractors to operate it. That will become very expensive very fast and hurt the other tasks you're trying to do. So that first tool was surveillance. The second tool was the patrol assets. And I absolutely want to double down on Admiral Kamenenko's statement about the Mark VI. It is the perfect, shallow depth operating in your territorial waters, self-protection, and another identification. Now, look, this is not the ship I would want my son to go in to go take down a destroyer or cruiser, right? But this is the one I want in our territorial waters, patrolling, looking, the exact way, by the way, the U.S. uses it. If you go to Coronado, to San Diego or Norfolk, but it's out there and it can get out to sea into your territorial waters. I would continue to work to get a limited short-range sea strike missile, an 8 to 10 mile missile. There's a lot of Army variants that can be modified that are reasonably low cost. It needs to have something. And this is going to be important later, because if everything has a missile, eventually the Russian Navy, when they contact a metal object and don't know exactly what it is going to have everything. They have to have everything they have to assume it has the longest range missile, and it will begin to inhibit their operation. So, but I like the patrol boats, and I think they're good in both theaters in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. And then finally, today, a tool that's required is land-based missile systems. It has to be mobile, easy to maintain, and you have to train on it. And you have to be able to integrate it with the situational awareness tools we just mentioned, because those tools plus these missiles will become, the protection of sovereignty initially. And then if you can demonstrate that, in other words, during those tests, being run, and I'm going to talk about a system in a second, it will have a deterrence effect. And so for this purpose, I think the Ukrainian development of the Neptune is perfect. It provides it at a cost that the government can afford, and it gives it the mobility, the maintenance, the training, the integratability. That'll be a hard one, the integration with the what the Mark VI is seeing, or more likely what the maritime UAV is seeing that's up. But that, to me, those are the keys. If you do those things in the short term, you can then do that's establishing SA, situational awareness, protecting your sovereignty. You can lead to your third task, procuring the force you need for the midterm. So the midterm being starting in about 2025. And it could go forward for 15 to 20 years joining a broader alliance structure like NATO would change things dramatically. But I'm going to talk about Ukraine as we see it today politically. 3 tasks there. First is continue to maintain that situational awareness. Second is protecting the sovereignty. And the third is executing sea denial. And by sea denial, I don't mean I can do whatever I want to do, but I can prevent you from doing whatever you want to do. And so if you can do those 3 tasks, you're really in a good spot. And again, the tools you need, surveillance and targeting assets. Now here, I do think you've shifted to the higher end. You start to consider some of the US MQs, and you start to think about whether they should be armed. In other words, do you want to have a response force up there? Now that weight's a balance. Once you take the weapon on, the persistence goes way down. So there's a lot of balancing in there. And better quality packages, electronic warfare packages, imaging packages, and dual imaging and radar, because and a big one. And again, this is 5 to 7 years from now. And then redundant communication paths to get that back to the targeting. So the first was, again, surveillance and targeting. The second is, again, land-based missile systems. And here I'd start to think about higher end. I'd grab Neptune, And there'll probably be another generation Neptune. But then I'd mix it with another missile that has a completely different seeker head. Maybe it's an evolved naval strike missile by that point. I'm not sure Harpoon really meets this, but I would personally stick with Neptune and maybe a mix of the naval strike missile, which was just sold to Romania. And hopefully 5 to 7 years from now, that case is opened and it's here. And that's important because if you can put two very different missiles on the same target at the same time, I think there's a handful of navies in the world that can deal with that. And I would not put the RF, the Russian Federated Navy, on that list. And then I'd have those land-based missiles really fully integrated into your C2. And here's why, because you're now going to have, and I'm going to talk about them in a second, ships out at sea. And of course, the most dangerous thing for any ship out at sea is being shot by a missile from your friendly land-based battery. So you really have to have that fully integrated C2. And so that's where you begin to get persistent presence assets. I'm excited about the Barzans, the 650-ton. It's hard to call them a Corvette just yet, but on the very, very, very low end of Corvette. But importantly, 9 times the size of a Mark VI, 3 times the size of of your island-class patrol boats that are being gained. This is a significant vessel in numbers. And so I'm talking about, 5 years from now, so they could be coming by that in numbers, able to be maintained in Ukraine, because if you build the back 6 in Ukraine, then you've got a maintenance capability in Ukraine. And now you're getting big enough to, if you look at the Thales radars and the associated comm systems on board, you can integrate with allies and partners in the Black Sea. And most importantly, you can communicate back to your land-based batteries that I am that piece of metal you're detecting out here. Please do not shoot me. Just that kind of philosophy. But, is there something beyond the Barzan? Maybe. But for now, just thinking about that, you achieve the mission sets for the midterm. And here's another beauty. It comes with its own missiles. I think right now, most of the if you look at the Greek or the Qatari, I think they're using exocets, and maybe that's what you end up with on these. But, you have a lot of options on what you use being fired out of these based on the sizes. Being 650 to 750 tons full load, you're able to do it. If this was in the U.S. Navy, these would be considered battle fleet assets. Our cut point's right around 550, 600 tons. So these are battle fleet assets integral with allies. So again, those tools in the midterm: surveillance and targeting assets, land-based missile systems, persistent presence assets. But look, this alone won't do it. And I think I'm going to I heard most of Admiral Kamenenko's comments, but I hope I'm a broken record on what he said, which is that you can have these systems, but you have to have the personnel and training to operate them properly. This takes resources. And this is the first place resources are generally cut as soon as a constraint comes in. But you have to be committed to the personnel development and training. And look, as much as possible, NATO and the US Navy should be supporting this. We should be providing surveillance and tracking reporting. We should talk about how you integrate surveillance and strike. We should be helping with maintenance on systems. Certainly the UK particularly should be getting deeply involved in that, given their role that they're going to have in the provision of some equipment. And then finally, that air-naval integration. Hopefully the Ukrainian Air Force begins to consider and establish the ability to do maritime strike. That's a group that I would want firing near my son's ship, even less than a land-based system, unless you've really demonstrated that integration. So that training. And as I said, the Ukrainian Air Force can be your friend. If they're not integrated, I'd stay in port. There's a second aspect. And then finally, it's beginning to do the integration of C4I with allies and partners. In other words, that commander surveillance on a persistent level, being able to push it back and forth with the Romanians, with the Turks, with US forces when they come in. Now, look, that's not cheap. It's easy to say that. It's expensive to do it. Expensive in equipment, expensive in personnel and training. And so I put that lower on the list because the first thing is these immediate term and midterm tasks need to be done so that Ukraine can protect itself. It can't rely on allies and partners. That integration of C4I with allies and partners is as you begin to become more, as your allies and partners become more reliable. So for me, those are the kind of tasks and systems that need to come online for the Ukrainian Navy over the next 5 years and the next 15 years. James, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you very much.
Admiral Montgomery, thank you very much. It was extremely innovative and disciplined out of the box thinking, and it leads me to ask a question to you later if there's time for me to do so. But for now, let me hand the floor over to my old and good friend, Glenn Howard.
That's clear.
Glenn, are you there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm on,
Go.
right? Okay.
You're on.
First of all, it's a great pleasure to be with everyone and such a distinguished group of also the not only the panelists, but I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. And I owe a profound amount of debt to Admiral Kavanenko, who's educated me endlessly about the Black Sea and Ukrainian naval strategy, or the lack of one. But you know, without people like Admiral Kavanenko and Captain Andrei Ryzhenko, who just left the Navy, we would be in a really, really bad place right now in terms of just not having an understanding of the area. When I've spoken in the past about Ukrainian Navy, I've always been pretty pessimistic, and I'm proud to say today that I'm less pessimistic than I used to be. But there's a lot of areas where I'll grade the Ukrainian Navy based upon my own interactions, and the way I would grade it is vision, infrastructure, development, and integration with allies. So in the way that Ukraine has tried to develop the vision, the Navy guys always had a vision. The problem was making the civilian policymakers, so-called civilian, including the Army brass, a little more aware of why they needed a Navy. And I say all this at a time when Captain Ryzhenko was pointing out to me a couple days ago that Ukraine, 80% of Ukraine's maritime borders have been occupied by Russia. That is an equivalent of 100,000 square kilometers of sea have been seized by Russia, leaving Ukraine only 37,000 square kilometers. So to put Ukraine in a box is a mild statement here. But I think that it's been, many of you know that it's been very slow going with cracking this land mentality among the armed forces. That is as Admiral Kavanenko mentioned, they still can't get the naval HQ in Odessa to move up to Kiev because the MOD does not want any type of Ukrainian naval pressure or influence among legislators in the Rada. But the reason I'm less pessimistic is that for a while we had someone as a civilian, Andrei Zarohodnyuk, who was the former defense minister, who immediately hit the ground running with a naval vision. It's almost like having, I would say, having Roosevelt as your Secretary of the Navy. That would be an equivalent to what Ukraine had with him, because he certainly grasped from a very early on in his short-lived tenure an understanding that the Navy needed to do something. And so I would say that has made me less pessimistic. The vision, they're now starting to, there's an understanding. I didn't say Ukraine always takes one step forward, two steps back. When Turan came on as defense minister, he was immediately against the Gurza boats that were built in Poroshenko's private shipyard in Kiev. So that, and because he was opposed to that, I mean, he killed it, said it was a useless program. And so that was a good thing. But the bad problem is that Ukraine also has many bad habits it can't shake. And its obsession with Nikolaev and building corvettes and loading the Navy up with larger infrastructure to support when there is no infrastructure. So to get sailors to man corvettes, they have to have bases and facilities support that. But of course, the idea is to put people back to work in Nikolaev and create jobs, right? So it doesn't matter what they. So this type of fetish that they have for these corvettes is still there. It's creating a lot of problems, and I'm going to briefly kind of highlight that. So the other part of there is some good news. Let's see Andre, can you roll my slides, Andre Dobryansky? He's got my slides if you want to start those. Oh shoot. Well, can you go to the first slide? I need to, if you can get the full. So here we go with it. Yeah, that's perfect. So great. So the good news is that the Mark 6s, the $600 million deal was signed in June 17, 2020. The good news is that the wheels are moving on the Mark 6s. We had to move heaven and earth to get that there, but thanks to a lot of good friends who don't want to be their names mentioned, were extremely helpful with this. So the infrastructure for the Mark 6s, at least in writing, things are still they're on their way. And so the plans is currently the goal is to get up to 18 Mark 6s. Ukraine will buy 2 to 4 of these boats. The U.S. has agreed to provide 6 of them. And this will become part of what Ukraine calls their new Sea Wolves. So this will be the fast reaction force that will be used with the initial island boats that were given to Ukraine. My understanding is that there will be a total of 7. They have 3. And what this is doing is it's starting to create kind of a layered defense for Ukraine when none existed other than the Gurzas, the little small boats that were basically outgunned and outmanned in November 2018. But these will start to become the core infrastructure of defending Odessa, to highlight what Admiral Montgomery calls sea denial capabilities by Ukraine. We're a long ways from there, but the bad habits of Ukraine kind of keep getting in the way. The bad news is that of the island crews that were trained in the United States, sadly, 50% of those sailors who came to the U.S. and were trained no longer serve in the Ukrainian Navy because the Ukrainian Navy and the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense still does not know how to keep the American trained personnel that it sends to the U.S. and promote them. So who can blame a guy that can serve in the Ukrainian Navy, but then end up making more money driving a cab or a taxi in Kiev? So this is where there's fundamental problems, as Admiral Kovanenko has talked about, that really need to be changed. And then you can get the Mark 6s and you can get new Navy crews and train them, but boy, if you can't keep good men in the Navy, you're going to continue to reinvent the wheel. So if Ambassador Taylor is on this call, I wish he would send a note to Ambassador Dayton, telling him to have the Ukrainians pay more attention to the core part of what keeps the Ministry of Defense going. And I'll tell you one thing, as we're all watching the war and fighting in Karabakh, where Azerbaijan is currently cleaning the clock of the Armenians, President Aliyev of Azerbaijan has spent the past 10 years building an army. And if you want to see what modern warfare will look like when you build a new army and build it from the ground up, and it's all Turkish trained and planned and equipped with a mixture of Russian weapons, boy, you need to look at that Azerbaijani army. And Ukraine could be there, but they're way behind. And I think, and I would agree with Admiral Montgomery, that Turkish drones are the way of the future, and I'll get to that. Next slide, Andre, if you could slide that on. Yeah, this is something else. When I talk about infrastructure development and vision, any those who are not Trump supporters out here, who keep citing gloom and doom for Ukraine and over Trump, I'll say one thing: God bless the Royal Marines. They are still Britain is upping its game in the Black Sea. And I'm not saying the United States has abandoned Ukraine or the United States has not abandoned the Black Sea, but I am telling you what the Royal Marines, what the Royal Navy are planning and doing in the Black Sea is, it's very Crimean Warish. And so we are back to what Britain has a long experience operating in the Black Sea, or did at one time. And the Royal Marines have started Operation Orbital, and they are now going around training Ukrainian Marines. And they have this training program with Orbital that is going around southern from Odessa down to Kherson. They're going around moving from place to place, training soldiers and trying to get this program moving. And the Brits are also focusing on Mykolaiv, and that's very interesting because for those of you who are World War II buffs, when the Germans occupied Crimea, they turned Mykolaiv actually into a shipyard and started rebuilding ships there from the Soviet ships they captured and turned it into a naval base, but also used it to refurbish the Kriegsmarine in its operations in the Black Sea. And lo and behold, you got the Brits now are looking at ways to build patrol boats, a British version of the cutters. They're in Odessa. Not in Odessa, but in Mykolaiv, and the Minister of Defense's trip to the UK resulted in a lot of deals that were signed, and Britain is really upping its game. And I would also point out that Britain signed a free trade agreement with Ukraine, big move on Britain's part. So this is free trade agreement is Britain is enacting its peripheral strategy in the Black Sea, and I think we need to keep an eye on this. And the Royal Marines also, and British paratroopers also landed in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago as a part of their exercises. They flew nonstop from England and landed in the Terziv, I believe, is the training ground where they dropped. So we're starting to see more kind of the integration with allies I talked about. We got the development going program. Ukraine has a program of naval infrastructure. Whether they get there, remains to be seen. Next slide. This is something Admiral Montgomery was talking about, and this is the big cash cow in the Ukrainian Navy. They spent $80 million to develop the Neptune, and they're still sinking money in it. Homchuk, when he became Chod, Chief of General Staff, he signed another deal to extend the research and development. So this is a huge waste of money. They keep saying it's around the corner, it's going to be deployed, but it's really it's a long time coming, and they need some short-term, fast, quick reaction problems. Now I will point out that this came from Admiral Kavanenko, that near to James Scher's summer dacha in Estonia, the Poles were there. They deployed NSMs to one of the Estonian islands, and they did this operational maneuver in 2019 called Spring Storm 2019, and the Poles put NSMs on the Estonian islands, and these are the Norwegian anti-shipping missiles. And I think it'd be a great idea to get the Poles to come to Odessa during Sea Breeze and make Sea Breeze more from a naval side into more of a land-oriented anti-shipping demonstration, and bringing the NSMs from Poland down to Ukraine and Odessa would be a wake-up call for the Russians. This would be the front page news of Krasnaya Zvezda, because it would get their attention. And our problem is shipping missiles are expensive, and anti-shipping, Ukraine doesn't have the money, and they're spending all the money on the Neptune, but they still don't have anything. So, and harpoons cost a lot. So this is one of my recommendations is that they kind of, get more involved, bring the Poles in. Next slide. This is something Captain Ryzhenko was pointing out. That's a very interesting trend that's going on with Russian Octopus. This is the MGK 608. This is a sensor that the Russians are putting on on the bed of the Baltic, and this is wherever you see a Russian pipeline being built. Word has it that they're laying these sensors, And so these sensors are really creating a buzz because the ability for Russia to detect. It's an underwater spy net of passive sonars. So move to the next slide, and it's called they call it the Russian octopus. Now the octopus is also being laid inside the Black Sea. Here up north, you'll see in the slide at the very top, you'll see that they are laying MGK 608 sensors. So this sensor system is going to be really key and very integral to what the Russians. They're really they're laying claim to the Black Sea in different ways. So they've gone from weaponizing gas platforms and developing the Navy and upping the game of the Crimean Black Sea Fleet. And so the U.S. is still kind of trying to play catch up. Let's move to the next slide. This is this gives you a better perspective of where the octopus sits with the Nord Stream pipeline. So, and this is when they're using, the Russians are using this, one of the most secretive classified units in the Russian Navy called the GUGI unit. These guys make upwards of about $100,000 a month, I'm told. They're the highest paid military unit in the Russian Federation. And these guys do deep diving and they lay these sensors, and they also are good at cutting cables. So on the slide on the right, you can see the underwater, that's one of the ships that lays that, that's in charge of cutting the cables, but they drop these hydronauts in, and that's where, and point out to you, Admiral Cabanigo wrote a great piece for Jamestown's Eurasian Daily Monitor several years ago about these hydronauts and what they're doing it was flagged to me earlier this week by Captain Ryzhenko, and so this is what's being built in Kerch. It is the equivalent of the Mistral. The Russians, when they lost the Mistral from France, they started laying plans for the 23-900, and they got two of these are being built in Kerch. But it's going to give them, I would say, Mistral-like capabilities with K-50 helicopters, and it's also going to be equipped with a battalion of Russian Marines. But if the two of these one will go to the Black Sea Fleet, one will go to the Northern Fleet. But this thing is going to give the Russians a lot of capabilities in the Black Sea that improves their maneuverability, and which we, the U.S., do not have a counter to because of Montreux, and we can't get things in inside the Black Sea because of Montreux limited to 21 days. I'm going to basically kind of cut off my talk there. What I wanted to say is that there's a lot of things occurring in the Black Sea, and I keep talking about integration with allies, and I cannot emphasize enough that the growing involvement of Turkey and Turkish military cooperation with Ukraine should not be overlooked at all. Zelensky just had a wonderful meeting in Turkey. They signed a number of defense deals. And as Mark pointed out about Turkish drones, you don't have export restrictions on the U.S. And Mark is right about bringing contractors and endless bureaucracy and more cost. You know, when the Turks they've transferred the technology to build the TBT drones to Ukraine. And I assume there's going to be a lot of Turkish trained Ukrainian pilots to fly those drones. So this increasing integration between Turkey and Ukraine in the Black Sea is going to create a new dynamic. And you throw in the Tuna gas field that the Turks discovered. It has gas deposits equivalent to the North Sea. And you're going to start seeing more Turkish involvement. And what's happening in the Southern Caucasus with Armenia, if Azerbaijan, I think, is going to retake all of Karabakh, and I think we are very much on the verge of seeing the end of Russian influence in the South Caucasus through this war, if it keeps going at the rate that it's going. I'm not sure if it's going to stop at some point, because these areas have been saying certain things. I don't want to get into discussion about Azerbaijan and Armenia and all that, but my point is that for Turkey, who's helping plan and strategize the campaign with Azerbaijan in Karabakh, okay, This is a golden moment because Turkey's starting to feel more confidence in its military capabilities in dealing with Russia. And that confidence is very integral because the Ottomans suffered numerous defeats at the hands of the Russians, and the Russians always had this kind of psychological one game up on the Turks mentally. Okay, and so what they're doing, what they did in Idlib, and what they did in Libya, is they've stopped the Russians at several points in their efforts to support their allies. And so what is happening in Karabakh with Armenia is a really, really turning point. And I cannot, many of us, Luke Coffey, myself, Matt Bryza, and General Hodges, we're all watching this, what's going on with that war in Karabakh. And believe me, a lot of people in Ukraine are watching that too, because it has a lot of implications for Black Sea security. And the Turks are getting ready in December to put the Anadolu, their first aircraft carrier, to sea. And that Anadolu can also be put in the Black Sea. So my dream is that during next Sea Breeze exercises, that the Anadolu would actually participate in Sea Breeze. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but I think I'm less pessimistic about Ukraine Navy than I was. There's still a lot of problems, and keep listening to Admiral Kovanenko and our friends, and we need more civilian defense ministers like Zaharnyuk, who kind of understood this. But I think I've been mildly surprised at how some things are going. It's not entirely bleak. So I'll end on that note. I see Walter shaking his head. Appreciate, James, you're very gracious with your presentation. Good to see you again. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Glenn. And thanks very much for the plug about the UK and the Royal Marines, which almost compensates for the swipe about Estonia that General Hodges took a while ago. My necessary function in the minute or two I have before acknowledging questions is to be a devil's advocate. It's made easier by the fact that in his last major paper for the Jamestown Defense Monitor, Admiral Kovanenko had this to say about the National Defense Strategy, which was approved in September. He had a lot to say about it, but he makes my core point, which is crucially, the document does not outline a cross-sectoral coordinated counter strategy. So I want, if I can, to try to turn all of you back to what I think is the central issue, which is the need for the system to think like a system and think strategically instead of thinking about all the bits. It's the difference between having the components of a Mercedes scattered around your garage and having an assembled, working, functional machine. Where is that deficit in systemic and strategic thinking going to come from? Now, I think we're getting to the point of saying it can't be naval alone, because what matters is how the naval strategy integrates into the whole, how the different services work together. Your point, Glenn, about bringing the Poles into a reconceptualized Sea Breeze format, I thought was excellent. So before turning to one or two, some questions that have already come in, any instant thoughts on that major challenge? Otherwise, I can go directly to General Hodges. Where did his question go? Yes. General Hodges, do you want to ask your question yourself? Are you there? Or I will read it.
No, I'm here.
All right. Do you want to ask your question yourself, or should I read it?
James, thank you. My question to both Admiral Kovanenko and my shipmate, Mark Montgomery, is about integration of Ukrainian officers into NATO navies, getting them on board ship. And I think Mark and Glenn actually both sort of touched on this tangentially. But the point is, of course, to develop that core of, or that demographic of officers that are accustomed to serving on board Ukrainian or NATO naval vessels, and also that go to school in U.S. Navy War College, Naval Academy, Royal Navy institutions for the obvious relationship and understanding, but also English language. I agree with Glenn. I saw it in the Ukrainian army that very, very few officers that were talented also spoke English. And if they did, they seemed to get off-ramped, frankly. Even though there are so many high quality officers, the language is going to be a limiting thing when you talk about integration with NATO. So for both of our admirals, if you could talk about what's the current status, and is there a lot more room to grow in this? Thank you.
Yes, let me start with answers, and after that, probably I'll pass the floor to Admiral Mark Montgomery. Thank you very much, General, for your question. I'm glad to see you here online. My answer probably would be short. I think at least 3 things should be done to implement your idea. It's speaking honestly, it's not new idea. This is really needs to be done. It should be implemented in the career management policy, and personnel should get the skills in NATO facilities, NATO on board of NATO ships, NATO states, the US ships. And thanks to using this opportunity, I would like to say thanks to Glenn, because I remember how he helped to send our sailors to the US destroyer, and how it has been done with Islands class patrol boats. Then Armed Forces Authority didn't allow to Admiral Voronchenko to visit the US, and because help of the Jamestown Foundation, personally Glenn Howard, it has been done. And after that, the process of takeover, handover of Island class patrol boats was launched. So it depends at least 3 things from my perspective. First, this is military authorities' strong will to do this, because in our system still exists approach when without highest level military leader decision, it's not possible to do this, because this is because he personally should make a decision to send personnel abroad, and a lot of limitation exists here, and so on. Second thing, I think what for this thing should be opened for combat personnel who got combat experience, who are working or serving the first line. So not only for staff, let's say staff officers, because this tradition still exists. And third, for those who got experience on board of the American ship, the US ships, and NATO states, educational installations, institutions, and so on, Naval War College, they should have opportunity to implement their knowledge, their experience. So the corridor for this should be opened in Ukraine, because quite often after their graduation, they return to Ukraine and don't have any opportunity to implement their skills, and still continue to work in the former or divided system with elements of former Soviet system and some element of NATO, let's say, standards and so on. it also these problems still exist. So at least 3 aspects from my perspective should be opened and should be changed, the policy approaches and so on. Thank you very much.
So I'll jump in and give my thoughts. So first of all, I fully agree that it needs to, with Admiral Kamenenko, that it needs to be fully exploited. And I mean that and with all the intent of exploit. We should get as many Ukrainian naval officers into the appropriate courses at the appropriate time as the Navy can afford. That's the Ukrainian Navy, and the FMF that supports it can do. Good news is Ukrainians in the level of economy that it's a reasonably inexpensive schooling. I would make some recommendations. I would avoid service academies. By the way, I'd apply this to armies as well. Betting on ensigns and midshipmen and cadets to be the future leaders is a very challenging thing. And if you're not careful, it goes to senior politicians' children. So I really think the most important thing is the division officer schools, department head schools, and war colleges for the Navy. If you come over, then you'll get that warfighting experience. You'll get that relationship building experience with Navy officers that you'll then meet and work with the rest of your career as you work your way up through the Ukrainian promotion system, and the U.S. Navy officers work their way through their promotion system. You can bet on known performers because you're betting on them as lieutenants or lieutenant commanders or commanders, vice back when they're midshipmen. And particularly the division officer and department head, you can get their 6-month programs. They're reasonably inexpensive, and you can get them through. Now, it's like the to put it in Army terms, the company commanders course that we put a lot of captains through and junior majors through from our Eastern European partners and allies. So I'm really all in on this. It builds that interoperability with allies and partners from the ground up, and you can see the challenges we face. I agree with Ben that the language training is the most important precursor, getting it right. And again, you have to make the right bet. You can't bet on an 03 or junior 04 and then have that person go through this training, get that skill set, and leave. So you really got to make the right bets. But I believe you have the ability to do that. And the war colleges are critical. And here, the Navy is a poor joint player, and that we don't value our senior war college. So I wouldn't make big bets on the 06 school. I'd make big bets on the 05 school, the service college, and get them in as commanders. So I'm fully vested in this program. It's the right way to go. And I believe, I know that the cost is still reasonable for the Ukrainian military as they crank these through. Now, you will compete with the Army for billets, and I believe there's a challenge there. But when I say for billets, I mean for the money that's available under FMF. That's all I had. Thanks.
Ben, go ahead.
Thanks, both of you. I just want you to see that I'm actually closer to the water than either of the 2 admirals participating here in Beaufort, South Carolina.
I'm jealous. Just to follow up, in the late 90s, when I was doing a lot of work on Ukrainian defense reform, real and so-called, I, as a control, did a lot of, also spent a year comparing Ukraine's problems and its approach to, shall we say, a Central European country that had just entered the MAP process. And what 2 of you described is exactly what I saw there, that people with NATO, younger officers and middle-level officers with NATO experience and training, and that mindset and that motivation, were leaving the service because their promotion paths were effectively blocked. And they were blocked because the people in charge of the system had deep psychological and institutional vested interests, and they knew perfectly well, if you let these people in with what they have learned, they're going to turn the whole system upside down. Which I know my Ukrainian friends cannot afford to say it, but I could say it. That is not only what the system needs, it's indispensable to starting what needs to be started. And that only changed in this case once that country was really advanced into MAP and realized we're becoming members of NATO, and NATO then had real leverage over what was happening. And there's still problems there and elsewhere. Right, I got two questions. One from, where did you go? Bogdan Chernyavsky, who would like a comment on the importance of securing sea lanes from major ports such as Odessa. I'd just like to follow that up with a point about deterrence. When Ukrainians talk about deterring Russia, what is Ukraine proposing to threaten Russia with? Can't on your own, even enabled, certainly not in naval terms, be threatening them in the foreseeable future with actually winning? But is it not enough to threaten them with incurring costs they don't want to incur and don't expect to incur, and trying to devise a force around that? But that feeds into the Odessa question and the sea lanes. So any comments, Admiral, about protecting sea lanes?
Yes, let me also begin this. Yeah, sure. This problem is still huge right now, because you know that because Russian activities in both regions, in both areas, maritime areas, in the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. In the Sea of Azov, if you would analyze the situation from the angle of naval strategy, naval operational art, Russia has a full naval domination there right now. So this is really the problem for us. Russia controls all sea lines in this area, in this region, and a lot of examples, a lot of difficult situation, and also we remember about Russian capture of our 3 boats in the vicinity of Kerch Strait at the end of 2018. So this situation still continues to be threatened. And the same situation is developing in the Black Sea, because Russia left only narrow corridor between Tavrida gas rig, and Serpent Island. It's about 25, 28 miles for international shipping to from Odessa. So this problem is very, very strong. To solve this problem, Ukraine needs to build as soon as possible. It's not a new idea. To build as soon as possible its mosquito fleet capabilities. So first of all, situational awareness, as Admiral Montgomery mentioned this in his briefing. Situational awareness to understand maritime situation. Their enemies located there, international ship lines, their vessels, merchant vessels, and so on. Second, to provide presence, naval presence in key areas, key nodes of international shipping, international vessels, merchant vessels traffic. It is important for fast reaction and understand situation there. And of course, it's an element of deterrence. And of course, the third is lethal capabilities to destroy enemy if it's necessary, to provide adequate response if aggression from sea will appear. So at least 3 elements right now we need to create. All of them, again, are parts of mosquito fleet, let's say, approach capabilities. And this is what should be done again as soon as possible. Yeah, thank you, from my perspective.
Excellent, thank you. There is, I think, time for one more question, which came from the audience, about your assessment of the recent Ukraine Turkish military cooperation accord. And I could just ask you to add as well, it's more recent, your assessment of the recent UK-Ukraine agreement, very recent.
Yeah, you know what our president yesterday spoke in Verkhovna Rada about both agreements. He mentioned what in his speech, he mentioned what was deal with memorandum of understanding between Ukraine and the United Kingdom in terms of loan 1.25 billion pounds allowed to strengthen, he mentioned this, to strengthen Ukraine's naval capabilities. Also, he spoke about defense deal with Turkey, and mentioned what it would be joint production of corvettes. I don't know why he didn't say anything about platforms, any platforms, what could be built together with the UK. But in his speech, again, I would stress what he mentioned, what it would be common joint project to build corvettes with Turkey.
I'll jump in on that and say on the UK Ukrainian deal, I think it's an excellent opportunity to link into our previous comments on education and training, that really they could drive through a great opportunity. If there is a academic infrastructure, or a military schooling infrastructure equal to the United States and NATO, it's the UK system. And you'd obviously have the same English language requirements. I think that it's absolutely appropriate to take advantage of that and push it. And I'm biased. I like the new patrol boats, as they come off the line. And I like the idea that they'll be built at some point after the second one, I believe, be built in the Ukraine. So I think there's a lot of great opportunity in that, and we'll see how it plays out. But I'm excited about the UK taking this, taking the initiative on this in a way, and I think the US should be generally excited about this. Admiral Kabaneka, and I didn't mean to cut you off, sir.
Yeah, absolutely agree. From my perspective, if some real capabilities will be deployed in Ukrainian naval forces, it would be only good. But my approach, my opinion is what we need to concentrate efforts on priorities. I think priority, because it's not a lot of money, available money, budget money, Ukraine has to strengthen naval capabilities. So concentrated of our efforts on priorities, I think it is an important thing. And in this regard, from my perspective, priority to build Mosquito fleet is the best way. So we'll see how the situation will develop. We'll see.
Thank you. I apologize to one more participant in the audience who has a very interesting but detailed question on a matter I think Admiral Montgomery has spent some time addressing. So just conscious of the time, just will ask, does anyone have a final word before we thank the three of you? Glenn?
Sorry?
No, it's all right. If you're probably still looking out of the window at the
I was looking at my notes.
Oh, I see. All right. Look, this has been an outstanding discussion as ever. Too short. It went very quickly. All the time in the world just rapidly disappeared. I look forward to, many of us will look forward to hearing it. I believe it's being recorded, hearing it later on YouTube, catching what we've missed. Even as chairman, I missed quite a lot. So thank you once again. I believe this is our last session today, but that probably means that Andrei or Walter would like to have a final word. So Walter, could I hand the floor over to you?
Yes, you can.
And a razor. Give him a razor as well.
What, to cut your
And a razor. And a razor.
Whose throat do you want to have cut?
Well, I just want to wrap it up by saying to the I've promised 4 aces on the second panel, and that certainly has been delivered. And I just simply also wanted to follow up on very quickly on what General Hodges had said about the language issue. If you look at the people who participated today, including Admiral Kabanenko and Minister Zahorodnyuk, I've been in the business so long now, for 20 years, doing these conferences, that I remember when everyone had to be translated out of Ukraine. And at this point, what you realize is the cultural attributes. It's not just the political and military, but the cultural attributes that people bring when they've lived and worked in the Euro-Atlantic world are just so invaluable. You can feel it. The mindset is the mindset of what we've been talking about, mature nation statehood, and the Euro-Atlantic world. And so I know that that's been bandied around and so on and so forth, whether we still have that Euro-Atlantic vision for the rest of us, but it is important. And we can see it with the wonderful presentations that both Admiral Kabanenko and Minister Zahorodnyuk have given. But again, to all my friends in the second panel, absolutely first rate. You've become very close friends of Ukraine, of my close friends, and I'm just very grateful that all of you made the time and the effort to make it. I can promise you that we are going to have the same kind of group explaining 2 more very important issues, and that is air and air defenses tomorrow, and as well as the question of general staff, senior staff officers, and the training there. We know that we're hoping that somewhere along the line, a little mini von Clausewitz might have enough strategic vision in Ukrainian future to be able to come and do his work. So the question is, and we also are going to be hearing from a truly iconic figure, General Philip Breedlove, as a keynote, and he will be discussing something very important of the preparedness that you've been talking about of the Ukrainian armed forces, how that's going to impact, and of what significance is it to NATO? Because that's a very important question. We've known NATO's relationship to Ukraine, but what does Ukraine, and being where it is, mean to NATO? And what should that relationship be? And we'll hear it from an iconic figure. So I promise you that tomorrow will be as important and as critical to all the issues as today was. And as I promised you, 4 aces on the third and 4 aces on the fourth panel, and 2 very important keynotes, one by General Breedlove and one by Dr. Snyder. And so with that, I don't want to keep you much longer. James, I know it's getting a little late for you out there. So I want to thank Admiral Kabanenko for his participation, but also wanted to thank Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. One last word to him on bullpens. He was not bullpen. He was actually the best thing that we could get in terms of this particular issue, sea warfare, and an American or a NATO perspective. I'm really grateful. And when it comes to bullpens, the Yankee bullpen did a lot worse than the Rays bullpen, and Yanks should have been there with the Dodgers, and they aren't. And so, as a native New Yorker, I really suffer. Anyway, with that, sorry that I take so much time, but we were on time. These webinars are beginning to work. We know that famously, all of you have been veterans of the conferences we've run, and you know how overtime they've run. This time, we made it. James, thank you. Glenn, thank you. Admiral Kabanenko, thank you. Admiral Montgomery, thank you. Thank you for those that have stayed on throughout, and till tomorrow. Thank you. Remember, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.